Part 8. Middle Kingdom. The remade state, 2000 to 1660 BC. 26. The court at home. The royal settlement of Itj-towy. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding the kings of Itj-towy is the whereabouts of their royal residence. For Itj-towy has entirely disappeared. That the court of the Itj-towy kings often followed the manners and customs of the Memphite age, and that the residences of those earlier kings seem to have been situated close to their pyramids, suggests that Itj-towy is to be located in the vicinity of the modern village of Lisht, some 40 miles south of Cairo and close to the ruins of the first two Middle Kingdom pyramids, those of Amenemhat-I and Senwosret-I. The very name of Lisht, indeed, appears to be a corruption of Ij, which the Arabic indefinite article has been added, so el-Ij. Recent excavations in the desert behind that village, moreover, have uncovered part of a haphazard group of houses that were inhabited in the centuries that followed the era of the Amenemhats and Senwosrets, when a line of fleeting monarchs had held the throne in quick succession. Now, several sources tell that Itj-towy had continued to serve as the royal residence in those times, so that a group of excavated house walls may well represent additions to an older central settlement whose remains still lie beneath the rows of beans and onions in the clumps of bright berseem that grow in the muddy waters of Lisht's kitchen gardens. Housing complexes built by the pharaonic state were generally designed symmetrically, and certainly the handful of such buildings of the times of the Itj-towy kings that are known today were laid out in patterns of orthogonal orthodoxy. The rectangular hieroglyphic determinative for the term Itj-towy suggests that the royal residence was set inside a high-walled enclosure and may have been built according to those same traditional principles. The walls of that rectangular hieroglyph, indeed, bear a patterning of mud brick paneling that had already been employed in Memphite palaces for 1,000 years. What that royal rectangle may have contained, however, is difficult to determine. Like all other buildings of the time other than tomb chapels and temples, its accommodations were certainly built of mud brick, with stone doorframes and roofs made of logs of acacia and palm, and their various parts would have corresponded to the standard set of forms employed in state domestic architecture: conical grain stores, courtyards, and oblong rooms of harmonic proportions, the largest of which would have held rows of roof-supporting columns. And, as the plans of pharaonic residences of other ages would suggest, those buildings would have been low, wide and somewhat modest structures that had not greatly taxed the state resources. Contemporary scribes variously name the residence of Itj-towy as the royal house or the domain, the compound or the palace of the king, or even the temple of the god, which gives the impression that its architectural arrangements had been a synthesis of shrine, store and royal household. For the first time in pharaonic history, various parts of the Itj-towy residence, or, perhaps, parts of its bureaucracy that lay outside the residence's rectangular walls, were described in parts of the courtiers' titles. Those courtiers could be described as the sealers or keepers of various warehouses and strong rooms from which, presumably, court provisions had been dispensed and craftsmen had collected their materials, like the titles and epithets of earlier times. However, it is difficult to determine what fixed roles, if any, those courtiers performed at court, which renders equally uncertain both the shape of the Itj-towy bureaucracy and the arrangement of the buildings that had contained it. On the other hand, the royal cemeteries at Lisht were organized along strict lines of precedence in much the same manner as those of the Memphite and Theban kings. Here, one compound holds the royal pyramid and the minor pyramids and shaft graves of royal women, whilst the tombs of most of the court officials stand at a slight remove outside that central compound. This suggests that the living settlement at Itj-towy had similarly consisted of separated zones, one highly circumscribed area containing the rectangle of the royal residence and other less defined areas holding state warehouses along with the Households and offices of the courtiers, craftsmen and scribes and those practically concerned with the state activities of building and the collection and disbursement of state goods. And if the settlement at Giza may stand as precedent, there may also have been a further physical division outside the royal rectangle between the residential zones and the state warehouses, grain stores, stone yards and harbors. Fundamentally, the rectangle of the royal residence, the house of the living pharaoh, had housed the king, the royal offices and the members of his household, human and divine. Here, the king was called the Horus of the residence. So along with the central archives of the state and Pharaoh's earthly household, its retinue of servants, scribes and musicians, the royal compound had also to accommodate rites like those conducted daily in the temples of the gods but which were centered on the figure of the living king. There was, as well, a hall of royal audience. And in those times when he was not visiting other parts of the kingdom, Pharaoh had sat in conclave at the royal residence with senior state officials, those courtiers, that is, who translators and title friends or confidants and who bore such titles as viziers and treasurers. The royal residence was probably also the location for the preparation and point of departure of a millennial continuity of pharaonic festivals such as the said Jubilee, which was certainly observed at Itj-towy, though the residences of the senior courtiers at Itj-towy may well have been somewhat smaller than that of Pharaoh, for they did not require space for the preparation and performance of the daily royal rituals and they do not appear to have accommodated so many women. Nevertheless, the households of both the king and the courtiers had required similar living accommodation and storage facilities. All those residences, too, had shared several formal architectural elements, most especially a large main entrance gate, some open courtyards with wooden columns and, often, a central rectangular pool, and several enclosed halls with more columns in them and access to rows of small rooms. Both the royal residence at Itj-towy and the mansions of senior courtiers had also held halls of audience, where the heads of those households had met their staff and visitors and had issued the orders and commands that the inscriptions record. And such halls, of course, would also have accommodated scribes in the archives of papyrus. And all those residences would have certainly accommodated potteries, weaving sheds and bakeries, kitchens, breweries and butcheries and, perhaps, craftsmen's workshops, along with accommodations for the main family, with smaller units for families of servants, scribes and musicians. The living heir of one such household, indeed, is yet held in the funerary models of Azir-Maketri, whilst the ghosts of their reality, their column bases and the thick stubs of their surviving mud brick walls have been excavated at the site of other court settlements, at el-Lahun some 30 miles south of Lisht, at Abydos, at several sites within the Nile Delta and on a smaller scale, at the mansions that had stood beside the fortresses of Lower Nubia. By pharaonic standards, some of those provincial residences were large and complex structures, with many open courtyards and large storerooms, and some 70 rooms of varying sizes, all of which suggest that they may have been built to accommodate both the permanent households of local officials and also the entourage of a visiting monarch, for the Itj-towy kings are known to have traveled widely throughout their kingdom. We may imagine, therefore, that the rectangle of the royal residence at Itj-towy had lain amidst the similar though somewhat smaller residences of the courtiers, and certainly the peoples of those various households had been in close contact. For many texts tell how the children of senior courtiers had grown up within the royal household, whilst the linens woven in the households of several senior courtiers were buried in the graves of women of the royal household at Deir el-Bahari. The settlement at Itj-towy had also included satellite households, studios and workshops of scribes and craftsmen along with those of the court sculptors and pyramid builders. Some of those workshops may have been situated within the great houses of the courtiers, others in the compound of the royal residence itself, just as a Memphite text describes how Pharaoh had overseen the inscription of a block of stone within the royal residence. So, too, the professions of royal gold worker, furniture maker, sculptor and other craftsmen stand out amidst a haze of ambiguous courtly epithets. At all events, though other state-supported workshops were situated at sites such as Saqqara and Abydos, the households of most court craftsmen were certainly at Itj-towy, and the artisans and craftsmen of that royal settlement had been so numerous, so well supplied and so closely integrated that a new court style had emerged soon after Itj-towy was established, a style that, from its exquisite reliefs and jewelry down to its domestic pottery, is easily identified as a product of the royal settlement. With such a gathering of households, the population of Itj-towy, that uniquely literate community of court ritualists, state government and fine craftsmen, the living heart of pharaonic culture, would have numbered in its thousands, and the structures of authority that ran right through it is yet glimpsed in some surviving documents. 1. Royal command, for example, orders an Itj-towy courtier to travel to Abydos to reform Osiris' cult and restore his temple. The text continues by describing how Epilogue restored the Osiris temple that had been built a century earlier in the reign of Senwosret, how he had adorned the god's bark and the sacred images with precious metals, fine woods and gemstones, and how he had reformed the rituals of the priests, leading them in festivals that had gladdened the hearts of East and West alike. And all this the courtier from Itj-towy recorded on 3 stone stelae, which were drawn and sculpted by excellent court craftsmen and set into a little mud brick chapel built on the wide plain of Abydos. Clearly, Eunuchs' texts are those of a royal friend and companion, a senior courtier close to the king, who had led a considerable team of craftsmen, scribes and ritualists. Another stela from Abydos shows how a similar order had been passed down through the offices at Itj-towy, from men like Eunuchs to members of their staff. A royal audience. The better part of pharaonic cargoes, the provisions and materials destined for the state's warehouses and granaries, its builders' yards and treasuries, were destined for the settlement of Itj-towy. As many texts describe, the court suppliers, the caravan leaders, the sailors, the leaders of the mining expeditions and the commanders of the fortresses of Nubia, had audience with Pharaoh in the throne room of the royal residence. Nor was this a mere matter of court procedure or etiquette, just as some temple builders and the men whom the vizier Antiphokar had ordered to deliver supplies of wheat to the royal residence had to shave their heads as if they were officiating priests. So, too, an audience at the royal residence took place in the same perfumed atmosphere as the daily rites enacted around the figure of Pharaoh, just as was the issuing of a pharaonic order to build a temple or a fortress, to quarry a block of siltstone for a sarcophagus or, indeed, to send provisions to Itj-towy. Those expedition leaders, those builders, sailors and craftsmen, had been summoned to the center of their universe, as is described in the story of the prodigal courtier Senwosret, who had fled to the Levant but who finally returns and meets the king and royal audience. Senwosret's description of the sphinxes at the doorway of the royal residence echoes the arrangements of the entrance to a royal temple, such as Khafra's Valley Temple at Giza and the temples of Abusir, all of which had similar leonine images at their entrances. And as at a temple, those Itj-towy sphinxes set before the great double doorway of the royal residence had announced a zone of transition from the profane to the otherworldly. Both the plans of other courtly residences and the determining hieroglyph denoting the word for broad hall that is, a chamber of audience, show that an audience with Pharaoh at Itj-towy would have been approached through a disorienting series of right-angled turns, a highly asymmetric progress that is quite outside the usual run of both formal pharaonic architecture and the natural landscapes of the Nile Valley, and, indeed, this approach was only shared by the passages that led to royal burial chambers and to some temple shrines. We may imagine, therefore, that, after passing through those sunlit sphinxes at the entrance gateway, the mixture of the dark confusions of the convoluted entrance corridors and sudden sunlit courtyards, Sinuhe, would have arrived at the doorway of the hall of royal audience having lost all sense of direction and, as the story tells, in a state of apprehension. For palaces could be dangerous places, and not only for supplicants like Sinuhe but also for the kings themselves. Another story of the time tells how Pharaoh had been murdered at night within his palace by people of the royal household when weapons intended for my protection were turned against me. Like all other domestic buildings of the time, the royal residence would have had small open windows set high on the walls, serving both for illumination and to enable the circulation of air. Of itself, mud brick is a splendid form of natural insulation, and pharaonic builders were skillful manipulators of the prevailing winds, so those cool, shadowed interiors would have provided a dramatic contrast to the dazzling sunlight outside, shot through with small bright beams of light. Glistening with golden dust, interiors were closed, gloomy and relatively chill. Angling from clerestory windows, the illumination from successive beams of light would have led Sinuhe's eye along a dappled line of columns towards a step dais at the far end of the audience hall, where the king, a small man in starched white linens gleaming with jewelry, sat on an elaborate golden chair of archaic design. Such pillared halls resembled the interiors of temples and had probably affected unaccustomed visitors like Sinuhe in a similar way. So even though he was accompanied by some of the king's closest courtiers and his name had been announced as he had come into the presence of the king, he had thrown himself upon the ground, the story tells, and was paralyzed with fear. Whereupon his majesty, the story goes, had expiated upon Sinuhe's foolishness at abandoning the royal court so many years before. Then, women of the royal household came into the audience chamber and the king had said to the queen, which implies that the royal women had proposed that they should sing a song accompanied by some percussive instruments, including sistra, musical instruments with small cymbal-like discs that rattle like hard dry leaves when they are shaken, and His Majesty seems to have agreed to their suggestion, for the tale continues with the words of 20-odd lines of carefully composed verses. In the conventional manner of court address, the women of the royal household first wish Pharaoh good health and long life, then congratulate him on unifying the kingdoms of the Sedge and the Bee, before concluding by asking Pharaoh to show the same compassion for Sinuhe as he naturally displays towards his subjects, a plea to which His Majesty must have acceded, for the following lines report that Sinuhe, the story seems to tell, had close connections with the women of the royal household who had pled his case before the king. Far from being shut away in an Orientalist harem, therefore, the royal household could be a lively and powerful presence in state affairs, and, whilst the royal audience itself appears to have been a highly formalized procedure, the multi-textured rhythms of the royal household echoed round that darkened hall just as they did in the temples of the gods. And this, it would appear, had been the usual way of things at Itj-towy. For the beginning of Sinuhe's tale tells that the death of a previous pharaoh had been signaled by an eerie silence in the closing of the great double doorway. Feeding Pharaoh, sustaining Itj-towy. Just one contemporary document has survived that deals directly with the nationwide supply systems that had provisioned the courts of the Eunuchs and Senwosrets, a formal letter concerning a grain shipment to the royal residence that, as its modern editor William Kelly Simpson has surmised, was probably the court at Itj-towy. That its sender was the same Vizier Antifoker who organized and undertook expeditions to Pun and Nubia on behalf of Itj-towy's first resident king. Amenemhat I enables the year 17 of its date to be assigned to the reign of that same king. The hekot was a measure of volume, which is a convenient way of quantifying stored grain. though, in a manner similar to the liter/kilogram equivalents employed in European marketplaces too. This day, it also served as a unit of weight, though the modern world encourages standardization of weights and measures. This was hardly the case in previous centuries. Many Western communities, for example, dealt simultaneously in inches, ounces, grams, bushels, meters and liters, which may also have varied in their quantities and measurements from community to community. In round terms, however, a hecot was close to an imperial gallon, so that the grain that Antifoker ordered to be delivered to the residents would probably have weight in the order of half a ton. If copper may be said to have shaped pharaonic Egypt, then its fuel, the enabler of its skills and the root of its prosperity, was grain. Though labor-intensive and a relatively low-yielding crop, it was a hardy and dependable staple and, unlike many foods that must be eaten fresh, it was easily conserved. Hence the enormous numbers of granaries of all shapes and sizes that archaeologists continue to uncover in Egyptian excavations from the settlements of the northern delta to the fortresses of Nubia. The most common grains of Pharaoh's kingdom were emmer and barley. They had complementary qualities. Hequanict, here FF, was certainly not the first farmer in the valley of the lower Nile to plant those two varieties in different locations according to the height of the annual flood. Emmer, the preferred grain for making bread, flourished in well-irrigated soil, whilst barley, which in good years was mostly used for beer and fodder, would grow in drier, salty soil. Though surviving relics easily give the impression that grain and beef had been the principal foods of Itj-towy, the reliefs and paintings in the tomb chapels and temples of the time along with a range of data gleaned by archaeologists confirm that hunting and fishing were vital parts of the kingdom's day-to-day provisioning. Various accounts describing the delivery of fish, pigeon, waterfowl and joints of wild meat to the temple's altars, to the households of the court and to gangs of levied workers. Many larger households, indeed, included families of river fishermen and hunters of desert game. Huntsmen had also accompanied state mining and caravanning expeditions. In reality, therefore, the food of the Itj-towy court, along with that of the wider population of the lower Nile, was derived from both the cultivated and uncultivated spaces of the wider region of the lower Nile. Field crops, horticulture, viniculture and herding mixed with wild foods from the marshes, the river and the surrounding deserts, providing a well-balanced diet which had enabled the maintenance of a general level of consumption well above subsistence level within a rising population, just as the condition of their mummies yet attests, and as the archaeology of several considerable state enterprises confirm. It was a diet which in the times of the Itj-towy kings had been watchfully maintained. A rare record of the diet of the Itj-towy court over a 2-week period is described in a fragmentary papyrus that, like the archive of Hequanict and the day books of the Nubian fortresses, was found in a Theban tomb. On this occasion, within the burial crypt of a certain Neferhotep, titled, in translation, an accountant of the main enclosure, i.e. Itj-towy, the fragment tells us that Neferhotep was given a fine burial and appears to have served the vizier Enku, the high court official who had overseen a restoration of the Abydos temple. For another scrap of papyrus from Neferhotep's tomb concerns that vizier's estates. Neferhotep's accounts detail the consumption of food over a period of 13 days by a king and members of his court during a visit to Thebes. As ever, the figure of this pharaoh is surrounded in a haze of incense and anonymity. On this occasion, even his name does not appear. Other texts, however, name Vizier Enku as serving the courts of several of the short-lived monarchs that had followed the Eunuchs and Senwosrets and who had also resided at Itj-towy. Certainly, Neferhotep's papyrus records its unnamed king performing the same role as his predecessors, receiving some provincial courtiers and a delegation of 3 Medjay leaders and visiting the temple of the god Montu at Madama near Thebes, whilst it was in festival. The royal party appears to have traveled to Thebes in flotilla on the river and had been housed, presumably, in the palace built beside the great temple of Amun-Re at Karnak in the times of the king's predecessors. Neferhotep's accounts list the royal entourage as consisting of various overseers and stewards, some scribes, musicians and militiamen along with the vizier Enku, numerous members of the king's domestic household, 4 royal children and a queen who may have been related to the vizier Enku. All in all, an interesting mix that would confirm the constitution of the royal audience described in the story of Sinuhe, in which female members of the royal household had played an important role. Neferhotep's papyrus is laid out as neatly as the records of the Abusir temples, but in 2 columns of accounts, entitled Revenue and Expenditure. Both columns are filled with carefully quantified amounts of food, loaves of bread, jugs of beer, and sacks and bundles of dates and vegetables, which are all added up at the ending of each day, with any residual supplies listed under the heading Remainder. Vegetables would have been brought in daily with the other perishables, and, naturally, they are counted swiftly in and out. Other longer-lasting comestibles, alternatively, serve as reserves in the accounting columns and also as supplies that could be augmented as need arose, with food raised by levy and donation in the same manner that the officers of court employed in their travels through the kingdom. Presumably, this unique record reflects similar processes of supply at Itj-towy itself. Certainly the various tiers of courtiers and their assistants, which are listed as receiving rations during the trip to Thebes, reflect the same divisions as those that can be reconstructed for the settlement of Itj-towy, one line listing the consumption of the officers of government and leading courtiers, another the extended royal family in the palace staff. The list of all of those consumers, that is, of the accounts expenditure in Neferhotep's accounts, is balanced by a list of court supplies collected under revenue. Apart from the extra provisions that were levied as need arose, the sources of supply are contained in 4 categories. One of these categories contains loaves of bread that had been supplied directly from the Amun temple and may have been ritually prepared, as were the daily offerings to the gods. Those provisions were probably sourced from the produce of the domains that previous kings had established to support the daily offices of Amun and the families of the gods' priests and servants. The other 3 sources of provision, however, are listed as being under the control of 3 courtiers, but it is impossible to determine where their supplies had originated. Like many roles within the court, the functions of those officials are hardly described in the translations of such titles as the head of the South. Certainly, there is no evidence from those times of a consistent nationwide system of tithing or collection, although a single surviving papyrus sheet recording a land survey and the declaration of its results to a royal treasurer is sometimes taken as evidence of a state tax on harvests. And, of course, that ancient survey effectively registers an assessment of that land's potential yield. Yet the document could just as well be a record of the measuring of land endowed for the upkeep of a tomb, chapel, or temple, and nowhere does it describe a tax upon the coming harvest destined for the upkeep of the state. Nor, indeed, is there any mention in Hekuanic's careful correspondence and accountings of a state tithe or tax, nor indeed is there even a reference to the king or an officer of state. An explanation of this gap in the surviving record, it has been argued that a pharaonic tithe was levied immediately after the gathering of crops and was not accounted for by Hekuanic as tax, like death, while simply an enduring fact of life. Yet taxes as a proportion of income are an entirely modern invention. The notion of a statewide system of taxation levied as a regular method of increasing the funds in the pharaonic exchequer is a pure invention, and in the unlikely event that similar pseudo-monetary processes had been in operation in pharaonic Egypt, some record, surely, of such vital components of state resource, would have been sanctified along with the rest of the state's activities, and thus some trace of such operations would have survived. There are, of course, simpler alternative methods of court supply. Methods similar to those that operated in the majority of courts before the modern age. Neferhotep's accounting of Pharaoh's trip to Thebes, for example, suggests that, when extra supplies were needed by the court to provision expeditions and building projects, they were variously sourced. Court officials enlisting fishermen and huntsmen and obtaining grain from farm stocks on an ad hoc basis, listed as gifts and donations. Such sources of supply are described in Neferhotep's accounts in the same way that manpower for court projects also appears to have been enlisted from the general population as need arose, and a wide variety of documents and royal edicts specifically exempt temple staff and temple stocks from the depletions of just such erratic tithing. As for the provisioning of the population of Itj-towy, the court may well have obtained its food from a series of estates, royal domains and colonies both in the delta and in the valley, in the same way that the tithes, the offerings, presented to the dead were raised from estates that had been specifically established for that purpose when the recipients had been alive, or the temple estates that had been established by the court and were administered by priests who served the gods. Seen in this light, large building projects such as pyramids and temples may well have required the colonization of new farmlands and new foundations, using labor levies fed from court-held stocks of food. Such speculations are sometimes described as a search for the ancient Egyptian economy. Yet no one living in Memphis, Thebes or Itj-towy could have recognized those words, for there was no economy in ancient Egypt in the modern sense, no abstract theory governing the elements of daily life, either on the farm or at the court, simply farming of itself, and a lush land, and on such a scale that its continuous expansion had fed the wider population and supported the activities of the court along with the activities of offering and building that catered for the gods, the dead and all their living servants. The unity that binds all the relics of the state, the pyramids, the tombs and temples, the written documents, the settlements, the products of the craftsmen's studios, is not a set of social, religious and political abstractions invented in other times on other continents, but an intricate set of relationships, of obligations between the living and the dead, to the gods and to the office of the king which bestrode them all. This, then, is a key point at which historians of the pharaonic culture decide to render their subject as either a primitive or aberrant version of modern society, the vision of ancient Egypt that Hollywood has derived from traditional academia, or, alternatively, to attempt to portray that lost and very ancient kingdom on its own terms, as honestly as the surviving relics and modern sensitivities permit. Floods in the Fayum. It is an obvious though much neglected truth that in states such as that of the Itj-towy kings, those who do not produce food are immediately dependent upon the farmers, fishermen and hunters who do so. Naturally, for the people of Itj-towy the acquisition and storage of supplies of food, the need to keep provisions flowing from the farmers to the court in all of its activities and dependence, was the overriding interest of the pharaonic courtiers. And from the time of the first pharaohs, as the earliest monuments testify, the state administration had driven agricultural production well beyond the limits of subsistence farming and had used those surpluses to enable the construction of pharaonic culture. Unlike the modern world, the pharaonic state achieved its colossal surpluses without the aid of technological innovations and with the most ancient modes of farming. Ultimately, of course, the demands it made upon its farmers had been met by the cornucopian fertility of the region of the lower Nile, its rich earth, wide river and strong sun. Such was its bounty that farming was lightly regulated, the officers of the state never precisely measuring its harvests, for the fragments of pharaonic accounts that have survived are filled with elementary errors of addition and subtraction, as long as the annual inundation was generous and uncultivated lands were available for further colonization as need arose. The court had functioned easily and so prosperously that it was able to simultaneously accommodate both its lavish building projects and a steady rise in the size of the general population. The river was the key. Flood levels, it appears, had begun to rise again. In the times of the Intefs and Montuoteps, and in the following generations, as the court moved north to Itj-towy, the three farming settlements of the times that were established to the north of Memphis, and have been excavated all employed the usual modular plans of state housing projects and were supplied with plates, bowls, cooking pots, storage jars and bread molds made in Nile Valley potteries. One of these colonies was founded on an abandoned Memphite settlement at a site now known as Maramba Abu Ghalib, which was situated at the beginning of the river's delta on an oxbow on a meander in a small branch of the Nile as it had begun its lazy passage to the sea. The other two were established on virgin land, on sandy delta turtlebacks, and are the first known communities to have been built at the site of Tel el-Daba in the eastern delta, where Levantine communities would later settle. The first of the settlements at Tel el-Daba consisted of at least 400 tiny homes, set beside a natural harbor amongst the meanderings of several delta streams. It may also have had connection with as yet unexcavated shipyards, but the humble nature of those dwellings suggests that, like the delta settlements of Memphite times, they had been designed to house families of workers who had labored in centers of food storage and production. And, indeed, the settlements at both Tel el-Daba and Abu Ghalib have yielded quantities of small flint blades, bearing that rare high shine, the so-called sickle sheen dash that is only produced by reaping. At all events, the relocation of the Theban court to Itj-towy at the southern end of the narrow Memphite plain must have required a considerable reorganization of its sources of supply, which led to the exploitation of the delta in the manner of its Memphite predecessors. Certainly, many more settlements like those at Abu Ghalib and Tel el-Daba lie undetected in the delta silt. At Bubastis, for example, in the eastern delta, a great palace, a governor's residence of the times of the Itj-towy kings, has been located, whilst two small temples have been excavated at other sites within the region. Some 30 presently unlocated delta settlements, moreover, are named in contemporary texts, and material from several cemeteries of that age has been found throughout the region. The court's move from Thebes to Itj-towy had also prompted a renewed interest in the region of the Fayum, a large and somewhat mysterious depression in the western desert that lies some 60 miles to the south and west of modern Cairo and just a few miles from Lisht. In the times of the Itj-towy kings, the Fayum was sustained by a tributary of the Nile known now as the Bahr Yusuf. In earlier millennia the tributary had broken through a slim gap in the Nile's western cliffs to empty some of the silty waters of the annual inundation into the Fayum depression and create an enormous desert lake, a quiet, closed adjunct of the river some 40 miles across. Nile silts in the lakes surrounding marshlands had supported farming populations since Neolithic times, whilst the pyramid texts had described the Fayum's fine fishing and rich pasturage as a place of creation, its fearsome local crocodile god announcing himself as. So with the court's return to the slim strip of northern silt at Memphis and Itj-towy, the means of its food supply had been secured not only by establishing state farms in the delta but also by improving the supply of Nile water to the Fayum, whose narrow passage through the mile-long gap in the Nile-side cliffs may well have silted up in earlier centuries due to insufficient inundations, and may even have been entirely choked by drifting sand during the interregnum. Such irrigation works were hardly revolutionary. From the beginnings of the kingdom, a variety of records tell of irrigation schemes and many texts describe extensive preparations for the annual flood. First levees were raised amongst local populations. These, perhaps, The origins of the state workforces that built the pyramids and temples. These levees were then set to work both to renew the ancient man-made channels that ran from the Nile out to the edges of the silt and to rebuild the catchment dikes built up within the farmers' fields. Once freed of silt, the channels could again conduct water across the full width of the flood plain. Then, in time of flood, the remade catchment dikes would trap the inundations overflow upon the fields to create a series of shining, shallow lakes such as could still be seen throughout the length and breadth of Egypt before the building of the two dams at Aswan. Thus, trapped, the floodwaters were parceled out amongst the various farming households of the area throughout the coming months, the supervision of those vital operations being the common claim of the texts in the tomb chapels of many governors and courtiers. Thus, the size of the cultivated land was maximized and the length of the growing season extended. Without recourse to such works in the times of the Itj-towy kings, the state's ability to supply the farmers' surpluses to its monument makers and to provision Itj-towy and all its other enterprises would probably have been impossible. No writings or inscriptions tell the name of the pharaoh in whose reign the work to improve the Fayum's water supply was initiated. In Medinet el-Fayum, the single modern city in the region, however, an obelisk-like column of pink Aswan granite some 42 feet high bears the name of Senwosret I. In common with the granite column of itself, most of the deities pictured on this unique monument, the principal gods of Itj-towy, including Montu and Amun of Thebes, Atum of Heliopolis, Ptah of Memphis, have been imported into the Fayum. It has been suggested that the indentation on the column's top had once held a statue of a hawk. If that were true, it would appear that the column had been placed near the rejuvenated lake as the reed which had grown up on the mound of creation, as the reed on which Horus the hawk had perched in the first days of the world, along with some odd granite blocks from long-lost shrines and some statue fragments bearing the name of Senwosret I's predecessor, Amenevet I. This splendid solitary column is the first evidence of substantial pharaonic building projects in the Fayum. None of these early monuments show evidence of the complex local cults of Fayum deities that, as the numerous fragments of later monuments found in the Fayum suggest, had been developed and monumentalized during those later reigns. The greatest symbols of the involvement of the Itj-towy court with the Fayum, however, are the placement of two royal pyramids, the first of which was made for Senwosret II, his builders having abandoned the plain of Dashur where all the pyramids of the later Itj-towy kings were built. Senwosret II's builders, alternatively, had set his tomb exactly at the point in the Bar Yusuf's progress where it turned sharply westwards through the break in the Nile cliffs to feed the Fayum lake. Today, the area is known as el-Lahun, which is a corruption of its ancient name, meaning the mouth of the canal. That once meandering ancient tributary of the Nile had already been converted into the deep straight-sided waterway known as the Hawara Channel, which still runs deep and fast through that bone-dry desert to feed the lands beside by the lake. Half a century later, the builders of the long-lived King Amenevet III erected a second royal pyramid complex beside the Hawara Channel. A work, it would appear, that had been part of a considerable national project for which, as the graffiti on his pyramids still tell, a large workforce had been drawn from all parts of the ancient kingdom and assembled at the royal residence. Recent studies of the geology of the region show that renovations to the flow of water along the Bar Yusuf and through the Hawara Channel had returned the Fayum lake to the vast size it had attained 500 years before, in the era of the Giza kings. Those changes in the Nile's flow also had considerable effect in the regions of the river downstream from that reopened water siphon. At its peak, it has been estimated that the ancient Hawara Channel had diverted around 1/5 of the Nile's water from the river, and this had served not only to decrease the height of the river's annual inundation below the branch of the Bar Yusuf but also to increase the river's flow in those same regions in the succeeding months, as the flood waters had receded and almost half the water that had entered the Fayum had drained back again into the main stream of the Nile. The powerful siphon of the Hawara Channel had a considerable calming effect upon the annual rise and fall of the great wide river from the Bahr Yusuf to the Mediterranean. An immediate result was that the builders of the Itj-towy kings were able to set the valley temples of the royal pyramid complexes closer to the river than before and lower down in the valley, whilst at the same time the burial chambers within the pyramids were set far lower down, with the result that some of those crypts now lie underwater and have never been examined. Another effect of this partial pacification of the Nile was that the lowest regions of its delta had been transformed from marsh to meadow. In normal years, the Nile's flow had decreased to about a sixth of its usual volume in the months before the inundation, the full height of the following flood, as recorded by Itj-towy officials from Nubia to Memphis, serving as an anticipation of the size of harvest in the coming year. Yet, the flow of the great river, its annual extremes of high and low water levels, were not dependent on a single source, for it was fed from three separate tributaries, known nowadays as the White and Blue Niles and the river Atbara. These sources were ultimately dependent upon the Ethiopian snowmelt and the annual rainfall in central Sudan, yet the three rivers supplied entirely different volumes of water to the lower Nile in varying times throughout the year. So if climatic conditions in the different regions through which they flowed had been erratic, the fluctuation between high and low Niles could be dramatic. That the Nile lost its usual majestic balance in the reign of Amenhotep III is testified by graffiti made by the scribes of the Nubian garrisons, who recorded a series of floods on the cliffs above the river that were some 20 feet higher than normal. In Nubia, some fortresses were damaged and others may have been entirely washed away downstream. In the kingdom, both canals and dikes would have been devastated. Grain stocks soaked, planting delayed, riverbank settlements and dockyards washed away and large parts of the newly reclaimed delta resubmerged. Recording similar disasters, graffiti of later ages described the papyrus columns of the Theban temples, standing deep in floodwater, as the swamp at the beginning of creation. It may well be, therefore, that those furious floods in the reign of Amenhotep III, the monarch in whose reign a considerable national workforce had been assembled and whose builders had set a second royal pyramid above the Hawara Channel, had prompted a further enlargement of the Bahr Yusuf designed to lessen the effects of such disastrous inundations at Itj-towy, Memphis and the Delta. Certainly, the Fayum priests of classical times had worshipped Amenhotep III as a god, along with his wife, the goddess Isis, lady of the granaries, and they had told the classical historians who visited their temples that the legendary monarch had undertaken enormous projects in the region. Those ancient tales are given powerful credibility by two-seated statues of Amenhotep III that had once stood at the edges of the ancient lake and whose fragments Flinders Petrie had recovered in 1888. One morning, he recalled, as he was walking to his excavations. Petrie's excavations soon determined that the quartzite statues had been some 50 feet high and that they had both been mounted upon limestone pedestals that had stood to half that height again and were decorated with the images of Fecan so-called Nile gods. The purpose of this strange arrangement, such high plinths are otherwise unknown in pharaonic architecture, was explained by the height of the rectangular walls which had enclosed each of the colossi in paved temple courts. In times of low Nile, the statues of Amenhotep III had sat side by side at the edges of the ancient lake, the two enormous figures looming over the walls of their enclosures and dominating both the lake and the surrounding land for miles. In time of inundation, however, the waters of the flood had lapped at the statues' feet, entirely, filling their enclosures and submerging their pedestals so that they seemed to stand, reflected, upon a vast lake that had extended to cover the entire width of the silty plain behind. As Petrie records, the gaps in The surviving blocks of the colossi pedestals had been filled with clean alluvial sand and silt deposited by those powerful floods. At that same time, the natural banks of sand that had built up around the edges of the ancient lake in earlier ages had been greatly strengthened and, on occasion, capped with mud bricks. This, it would appear, was to contain those same high floods. It has also been suggested that a second man-made cutting off the Hawara Channel, which was operated as a sluice in classical times, had originally been opened in the last century of the times of the Itj-towy kings, not as an improvement to irrigation, but to siphon more of the Nile's high-rising flood waters into another nearby depression in the desert, to create a secondary overflow basin within the Fayum to contain those disastrous high Niles. At all events, just as Amenhotep III's colossi had dominated the lakeside throughout the following millennia, so, too, the ruins of his pyramid stand at the point in the Hawara Channel where the second cutting had been made. The settlement of Shahate, the ancient center of the region of the Fayum, now lies beneath the provincial capital of Medinet el-Fayum. In the times of the Itj-towy kings it held temples part built from blocks of imported stone. At that same time, other temples were established in the Fayum, and new gods such as Osiris of the Fayum were introduced. Alongside Sobek, the region's ancient crocodile god, a host of splendid statues, some superb images of the Itj-towy kings, have since been found at these little-known monuments, most remarkable of all being a group of near life-size cast copper statues of Amenhotep III, some queens, 2 priests and a crocodile, all of them trimmed with gold and silver and set with lively inlaid eyes. Judging by their beautiful green patina, this unique group had stood for some considerable time within the desert, in the enclosure, perhaps, of Amenhotep III's mortuary temple at his Hawara pyramid, a now largely vanished structure whose inflated size and architectural complexities once earned it the classical title of the Egyptian labyrinth. On the north side of the lake, and well beyond the gaze of the 2 vanished colossi, stands the perfect little temple of Khazar el-Saga, made of massive blocks as brown as the surrounding sand, and holding fine-made shrines for 7 unnamed deities, though not a single text. It is the only temple of the times of the Itj-towy kings to still stand today. 2 gridded mud brick housing settlements were built near to this temple, designed, perhaps, to accommodate its builders and the households of its priests. A landing stage for stone barges lies close by, but nowadays the little group of buildings stand high and dry above the shore of the brackish and shrunken successor of the ancient lake, a white line in the distant haze. When its waters had been high and harvests good, that ancient temple was reflected in the mirror of the lake. 27. Living in the state. Working for the state, the Thinis Dockyards. In 1904, George Reisner's excavations in the provincial cemeteries at Naga el-Dir, close to Abydos, brought to light an anonymous tomb containing a remarkable set of documents. The expedition's photographs show 4 frail rolls of papyrus, riddled with insect holes, lying just as a hand had set them down 4,000 years ago, on the dusty top of a box-like cedar coffin, one of 3 that had been crammed together in a little crypt. In all likelihood, for nothing in the tomb told anything about its occupants. The burials were those of the members of a scribal household, whose work had been connected with the provincial operations of the Itj-towy court. Those tattered ledgers, as their editor and interpreter William Kelly Simpson describes them, proved on average to be 6 feet long, the largest almost twice that length, and written on them all, in swift, workmanlike hieratic by hands honed on thousands of such documents. Several scribes had set down records and accounts in a series of page-like folios, each one a little larger than an A4 sheet of paper, one following another along the scrolls. Though modest in their content, they document some of the daily activities of one of the widespread communities who had supplied the Itj-towy court and built its boats and monuments, but whose lives and daily work are otherwise unknown. Compiled in the times of the vizier Antiphocr in the reign of Senwosret. The so-called Naga el-Dir papyri record some of the activities at the nearby boatyards of Thinis, at least as old as the early Memphite kings. The Thinis boatyards had been revived by the Itj-towy courts and were serving as a regional center, as both a transit hub for state traffic on the Nile and as a staging post on the caravan and sea routes to the south. The Thinis dockyards, indeed, had supplied both ships and shipwrights to the port of Fayum during Antiphocr's expedition to the land of Punt. 3 letters of command sent from the offices of the vizier Antiphocr are recorded in the Naga el-Dir papyri, which suggests that their recipients at Thinis had operated under his direct control. They also tell that the settlement at the boatyards had access to the produce of local estates, for one of Antiphocr's letters orders large stocks of grain to be shipped from the boatyards downstream to the royal residence. Operating as a dependency and outlier of the Itj-towy residence like the staff of royal temples, its workforce was protected from recruitment in the state corvée, for another of the vizier's letters concerns the improper requisition by another court official of some of the dockyard's craftsmen, whilst the third letter deals with the intricacies of finishing and delivering a royal boat, its oars and bailing scoops, its cleats and mallets. By far the better part of the contents of these papyri consists of various accountings. One, for example, records the work of the shipyards toolmakers, detailing the delivery of copper and its recasting into the boat builders' chisels, adzes, axes and other blades and engraving tools. The brevity of these records, however, along with lacunae produced by insects, time and in the scribe's use of many as yet untranslated terms, hampers their full translation. Nonetheless, the compiler's minute attention to detail emphasizes once more the essential role of copper, that precious hard-won ingredient, in shaping courtly culture. No less fascinating are the lengthy lists of the names of sons and daughters from various households in the region of Thinis that were recruited to work on various state projects. Each person is identified by his father's name, followed by his own. Sometimes, 3 generations of the same family appear to have been called into service at the same time, Ink's son Nikti, followed by Nikti's son Sobkivit, being listed as members of the same gang one beneath the other. Grouped in 10, 50 and 100 people, the gang numbers seem quite small, given the tasks that they were set, although the individuals that are named may well have brought other members of their households with them or even sent substitutes for their own presence at the worksite. At all events, the gang's tasks range from serving as sailors on the voyages of court officials to making mud bricks, the latter task accompanied by a close accounting of the quantities of the chopped straw used for their bonding, which is an expensive commodity in rural Egypt down to this day. The gang's work also included cutting acacia and sycamore trees that grew down by the riverside, this perhaps to fuel boatyards' copper furnaces and for use in cooking fires. For some of the records in the papyri seem to record deliveries of fish, pigeons, fowl, and joints of meat. Other sections of the Naga el-Dir papyri appear to deal with the construction of tomb chapels or temples, for they record the dimensions of the chambers of an unnamed building and the thicknesses of its walls, along with estimates of the amounts of work required for their construction, from the shipping and hauling of their stone and the making of mud bricks to shaping and laying their column bases and foundations. That the scribes measured those various tasks in man-days would have enabled speedy calculations of the rations of food that such projects had required, the bread rations of each of the individuals enlisted in corvée being accounted in terms of the days that they had worked. These records, therefore, shed light on how the creation of such buildings had been visualized by the Itj-towy court, for they are estimated in terms of the amount of men and provisions required for their completion. The longest tours of duty on these corvées are of 2.5 months, and several gang members are described as fleeing from a project, this, perhaps to help with the family harvest? By modern standards, however, the workloads that the scribes have calculated for the completion of their tasks seem low and rations generous enough, so life on Pharaoh's building sites, it would appear, was not so very hard. Housing by the state, the settlement at el-Lahun. Though the pyramids of the Itj-towy kings have been reduced to formlessness, a settlement connected to the royal cult into the construction of pyramids and temples has survived remarkably intact. Set close to the Hawara Channel and the Fayum at a site that is known today as el-Lahun, it had housed several thousand people for well over a century and is the largest of all known courtly settlements of the times of the Itj-towy kings. It was also one of those uncanny places in Egypt where the intimate debris of ancient lives lay just a few feet underneath the modern surface of the desert. The settlement at el-Lahun was excavated in the spring of 1889 by Petrie, who had previously been digging around the denuded ruin of the nearby pyramid of Amenhotep. Nothing if not competitive, Petrie had got wind that another excavator was planning to work at el-Lahun, so he put a small team of men to dig unsupervised within the ancient settlement, before taking personal charge of the excavation during the following winter season. His method was straightforward enough. As the settlement's houses were laid out in the manner of all such courtly colonies, in precisely measured rows, he simply dug out one dwelling at a time, using the rectangular hole created by that excavation as the dump for the filling dug out of the next house in the line. Thus proceeding, he excavated virtually all of the surviving houses at the site in just 2 short winter seasons, some 230 dwellings of various sizes whose walls had been preserved to 2, 4 and sometimes 5 feet off their ancient floors. The dig yielded extraordinary amounts of material, which Petrie, a man who more than any other archaeologist working in Egypt at that time was fascinated by the minutiae of ancient daily life, briefly summarized in the resulting publications. At that time, unfortunately, Petrie was at the beginning of his career in Egypt, and modern archaeological method was quite unknown, so that today is speed of working, his ways of digging and recording, have led modern archaeologists, who in the last decades have regained an interest in such domestic sites, to resurrect the processes of his excavations at el-Lahun. From his faded photographs, his plans and scribbled diaries, despite later discoveries of some similar courtly settlements, el-Lahun remains unique, not only in its sheer size, in the quantity and the quality of domestic objects that it had held, the detail of its daily life, but also because of the large numbers of fragmentary papyri that were found within its houses. And like the site itself, those documents have also been the subject of renewed interest in recent decades. So, along with the careful modern excavation of other somewhat similar contemporary settlements, the renewed study of the documents from el-Lahun has led to a wider vision of that enormous site, founded in all probability in the reign of Amenhotep. The repetitive internal architecture of the houses at el-Lahun was modified over generations, and most of the objects Petrie recovered were from the households of its later inhabitants, when the courtiers and builders of Senwosret III had been engaged in constructing his pyramid and temples, which stood a mile to the north. Nonetheless, a rare piece of Cypriot pottery that Petrie found lying on a house floor and which had probably been imported through Tel el-Daba, had been made in yet later generations. So el-Lahun had remained in use in times after the kings of Itj-towy, its streets and houses continuing to accommodate a variety of households and occupations. Set within the desert but at the edge of the ancient floodplain, part of el-Lahun has been eroded through the ages, probably as a result of the river's rising inundation levels. Assuming that its original design had been symmetrical and similar to the other courtly settlements of the times, it would originally have been rectangular. Then, it would have held some 32 acres of dwellings, the walls of its perimeter entirely filled with 400 tiny houses set on narrow alleys, along with 2 temples. One of those housed the jackal god Anubis, who was associated with the dead, the other, Sobek, of the nearby Fayum. A third of the entire settlement, however, was taken up with 10 spacious dwellings, whilst another larger mansion, often identified as the king's house, stood above all the others on a so-called acropolis, built along the settlement's northern side on higher ground. Those large mansions were similar in plan to others that have been excavated in recent decades at Abydos and Tel el-Daba, in Nubia and the Delta, and as the surviving contents of those other dwellings serve to underline, each of those 11 mansions had held considerable households and were probably the homes of court officials with connection to the king. Many of the settlement's smaller houses, alternatively, which were set nearer to the silt, contained rakes and sickles and other farming implements, which suggested to Petrie that their occupants had farmed the nearby fields, a supposition borne out by passages from the settlement's fragmentary papyri which deal with agricultural matters. Placed within the pattern of the settlement's commanding grid, each of the 10 great mansions had held rooms and workshops that contained many of the functions that are described and sculpted in such detail in Maquette-Rie's Theban funerary models. At el-Lahun, however, rather than being housed in separate buildings as they are shown in Maquette-Rie's models, all of those facilities, the animal pens, the granaries, the bakeries, the weaving studios and the like, were packed together side by side into each one of the mansion's half-acre rectangles, and the domestic quarters of all of those great houses had held bathrooms, lavatories and bedrooms, audience halls and gardens, shaded colonnades, and shallow pools with rows of trees and flowering plants. The mansion's most astute observer, the archaeologist Barry Kemp, has calculated that their considerable granaries could have stored sufficient grain to feed the entire settlement for around a year. One might well imagine, therefore, that the inhabitants of the tiny row houses, which were packed in perfect symmetry, alley upon alley, within the lower sections of the settlement, had worked on behalf of those 10 great houses, whose inhabitants had probably controlled large estates upon the nearby plains and had gathered their harvests in the mansions' granaries. Officials and priests working within the nearby pyramid temple of Amenemhat II had also lived at el-Lahun, for some of the settlement's papyri that were drawn up in the times of Senwosret III detail the rotas of the files of priests and other staff who had served within that temple, listing the statues and processions, recording the appearance of Sirius, the rising of the star that announced the coming inundation. Parts of those fragmentary archives are somewhat similar in their content to those found within the earlier pyramid temples at Abusir. At el-Lahun, however, some blocks of small row houses close to the vanished mortuary temple had served, so the papyri tell, to house both agricultural workers and the files of the temple's personnel, and a dividing wall would have ensured the ritual purity of the members of those files whilst they were serving their turn, by isolating their houses from the rest of the settlement. This mixed usage over many generations would account for the fact that, of all known settlements set near pyramid temples, el-Lahun was by far the largest in that its wide range of functions were involved in various core projects, whilst its extensive grain stores may also have helped to support nearby Itj-towy. Like the 10 great mansions, the row houses of el-Lahun were laid out in strips of identical size but grouped in rows of 8, line upon line of them, set back to back, and each one entered from a narrow alleyway. Inside this plan, each dwelling had 5 or 6 rooms laid out in modest, stripped-down imitations of the mansions up above, with everything down to the dividing streets and alleyways precisely measured out in cubits, though they do not appear to have had upper stories, for Petrie found no staircases within them. Numerous tomb chapel paintings and models suggest that their roofs may have performed a variety of services. from summer sleeping areas to fuel storage and food processing, and that access to them may have been by ladder. The doorways of these little houses appear to have been arched. Petrie found a painting of a row of them on the wall of one of their rooms. In similar fashion, some of their narrower rooms had been vaulted, their builders simply drawing the outline of an arch on the upper part of a wall and then laying the vault in the manner of modern Nubian bricklayers by working backwards through the open room, placing the dry bricks without any supporting form directly into muddy mortar as they worked along the vault. Larger rooms were roofed by beams and palm leaves, stone and mud, supported as neat rows on columns of wood, though most rooms were so small that the modest spans of twisted local woods served on their own. The rooms mud plastered. Walls had usually been painted with white gypsum over a dark-colored dado, and, just as maquette Reeves models have painted bands of color at the tops of their dados, so those at el-Lahun had been similarly finished in lines of red and black. Petrie found many wooden door frames and bolted wooden doors still standing in the settlement, hinged top and bottom by spikes of wood projecting from the doors and set on stone block pivots. The wooden spikes had worn down after many years of use, and old sandals had been placed into some of the pivot holes to raise them up again. Rats had run freely through those little dwellings. Petrie noticed there holes in the mud brick walls, some of which the householders had stopped up in a vain attempt to block the vermin's progress. He also found a ponderous ceramic rat trap, though judging from its clean interior it had never been put to use. Many domestic objects, plates, pots, buckets, sickles and hoes, had been perfectly preserved, and Petrie especially remarks that a cache of chisels and a copper pot that had been hidden during a late phase of the settlement's occupation were as bright as the days they had been left, and in white painted wooden boxes like those the Itj-towy sailors had taken on their boats to punt. The people of the settlement had stored their mirrors, tweezers and cosmetics. They had also placed dead and stillborn babies in those boxes and buried them beneath the house floors. Sometimes, 2 or 3 small corpses had been laid together, with little necklaces and amulets decorated with the names of the Itj-towy kings. Although the kitchens in the mansions had been set apart, those in the row houses were very small, their simple hearths set directly on the beaten earth against the living room wall. None of those houses, however, were used like modern Western family dwellings. Even the living quarters at the heart of the 10 mansions appear cramped and crowded. In such comparisons, for all of the dwellings at el-Lahun had little room for furniture, some people sleeping in niches set in the walls. Nor were there any open areas within the settlement, no piazzas, no public space, other than the audience halls within the mansions in the open courts of temples. There would appear to be no examples of planned public spaces in all of ancient Egyptian architecture. From the 10 great mansions above to the tiny row houses below, the accommodations at el-Lahun had housed a tightly closed, face-to-face community. Nonetheless, all of those accommodations had been most carefully maintained, and at least some of their occupants had greatly appreciated them, for, as a hymn found on one of the settlement's papyri gratefully records, Pharaoh had provided them with community and being. Amidst the storerooms, the audience halls, the vestibules, the gardens, and the workshops, the single central units in most ancient Egyptian houses were the quarters that accommodated extended families. In the smallest houses, these had consisted solely of sleeping and living areas, whilst most of the larger dwellings had tiny dressing rooms and bathrooms. Curiously enough, this scheme is hardly represented in the state-designed gridded row houses that are so small that they could only have housed nuclear family units. Later generations, however, had joined together groups of adjacent row houses so that they could accommodate several generations of an extended family, and other people who were outside the family group. At el-Lahun, the generations of men who had lived within the row houses had presumably worked together in the fields and in the construction of the nearby royal monuments where, so the papyri tell, they had later served as priests and ritualists. The women of those same households, alternatively, wove cloth, made food and brought up children, a task that, as the numerous bodies of babies at Petrie found beneath the house floors underline, had been a permanent and pressing need. On a larger scale, the mansions of el-Lahun, like those of other courtly settlements and of the grand provincial households of the time, had been similar to the royal residence at Itj-towy, with satellite households of scribes, factors and craftsmen, farm workers and herdsmen, fishermen, cooks, brewers, gardeners and servants. And in their turn, those smaller households had drawn on pools of skill and labor held in the households of local farmers, whose members could also be enlisted for harvesting the fields of the great estates, for the maintenance of irrigation basins and for conscription and corvée for monumental building work. For the most part, the rations allocated to the smaller satellite households of non-farmers had consisted of goods and provisions that the large households produced on their estates and in their workshops. And these were usually distributed in raw form, requiring further processing, game and fish and joints of meat, grain from the granaries that could be fermented to make beer or baked in household ovens, and wool and flax that had to be spun and woven on festive occasions. Alternatively, and when groups of workers were conscripted to perform work away from home, their rations had included ready-made bread and beer, cakes and clothes, all such provisions being produced by and brought from the manufactories and estates of the great provincial households or from Itj-towy itself. At first glance, the different house sizes at el-Lahun echo the traditional view of the three-tiered structure of ancient Egyptian society, a view reflected in the decorations of contemporary temples and tomb chapels, from the largest figure of the king or noble to the diminutive images of the craftsmen and the farm workers. Recently, and in much the same manner as Marx had characterized the newly minted rich of the 19th century, an emergent middle class has been added to that fundamentally three-tiered vision, conjured from such sources as Hequanic's archive and the numerous richly furnished but non-noble burials that were set within the cemeteries after the ending of the Memphite monarchy. Add that picture of Itj-towy society to the common notion that in ancient Egypt the relative sizes of houses and funerary monuments can be measured in the manner of modern consumer goods, as public displays of wealth, and you conjure up the common yet distorted vision of that ancient state with a godlike pharaoh, the kingdom's richest and most powerful individual, with nobles such as Anku and Antifoker competing with their contemporaries for power and royal rewards, with squires like Hequanic, a sort of disassociated rural middle class, operating as natural capitalists, and with the poor old peasants as an unwilling proletariat. The roots of that travesty lie in Champollion's time and in the following generations, as the order of early modern Christendom broke down and industrial society developed, subjected to rigorous analyses. Later in the 19th century, the social categories that had been distinguished within those new industrial societies were then imposed upon non-Western cultures, where they served to provide a scientific ring to attitudes of many middle-class academics, such as those of the Berlin School, who had instinctively viewed the order of ancient societies as based on power, prestige and wealth. In relation to the realities of ancient Egypt, however, analyses using those criteria are like the reports of Lord Cromer's 19th century government officials, which priced the labor of illiterate Egyptian village farmers with an eye to paying off the Khedive's international debts. Pharaoh's Egypt, on the other hand, was a land inhabited by the gods, the living and the ancestors, a land in which stability and prosperity were won and could only be maintained by working in the age-old ways. That is, by building more monuments and continuing to offer to the gods, and honoring the contracts between the living and the dead laid down in thousands of offering lists. Although courtly favor could increase, Individual prestige, the fundamental interrelationships within pharaonic society were fixed along with those of the sun, the seasons and the stars. So it is not surprising that the iconic image of pharaonic culture shows the king performing the act of killing some of the harbingers of disorder. 4. In a society where morality, prosperity and social order were all as 1. Rebellious behavior, from that shown by frisky animals to that which was apparently displayed by the son of Vizier Antifoker, was evil and reviled. In these terms, wealth was simply the accumulated provisions of a householder, as the text of a stela placed by a certain Montuser in the enclosure of Osiris at Abydos neatly defines. Such riches served both to physically maintain Montuser and his household and to confirm its relationship to the gods, the ancestors and the other living households of pharaonic society. No Bronze Age culture, of course, had been driven by notions of material progress. It is extremely unlikely, indeed, that the people of those times had held concepts of public and private ownership similar to ours. Despite his worries about the size of harvests and his stocks of grain, Hecwanix was not a capitalist. Rather than working hard to increase his consumption of goods and services within a market-based economy, his overriding objective was simply to maintain his household's well-being and its status in the community. At first glance it seems surprising that in a culture where extreme precision was a hallmark of stonemasons and craftsmen, there are dozens of simple accounting errors in Hecwanix archives, and also in the surviving records of the state. Yet accounting in a modern manner was not their compiler's primary concern. Hecwanix's careful list of work performed, of his dealings with his neighbors, of lands loaned and goods traded, are not the shoddy records of a tired bookkeeper but the archives of his household's social obligation. No wonder, then, that attempts to establish a basic wage for Middle Kingdom laborers have largely failed, for the records of building work kept by the scribes of Naga el-Dir contain simple errors both in their calculation of man/days worked and in the seemingly overgenerous amounts of rations allotted to the workmen. In reality, those wages were simply supplies of provisions of sufficient quantity and quality to keep one or, perhaps, several workmen working well. This is not to suggest that the Itj-towy state had been an earthly paradise. Doubtless, there were as many cruelties inflicted within the ancient kingdom as there are within our modern world. And, certainly, institutional light-handedness had hardly been a feature of the frenetic age in which the great pyramids were built, like the image of the smiting king. The batons held in the hands of the images of foremen in the courtiers could token painful punishment. Although the demands of the Itj-towy state upon its population had certainly relaxed since the delirium of pyramid building during the reigns of Sneferu and the Giza kings, the kingdom always required manpower of its population. As the Naga el-Dir papyri and some of the texts within the mines and quarries confirm, corvée conscription was still a part of life in the times of the Itj-towy court, and those caught attempting to flee such work could be harshly punished. And of course there was no liberty in ancient Egypt. For liberty, essentially, is a concept born of slavery. It is, in fact, its opposition, slavery being a product of societies that have reduced human beings to the unitized abstractions of goods for sale in a marketplace. Nevertheless, in Middle Kingdom Egypt, the state's touch could be light. In all of Hecwanix's surviving correspondence, for example, there is not a single mention of the king nor of the government. And of course, corvée and conscription could never have been more pressing than the need to harvest or to undertake those other seasonal activities which form the universal treadmill of agrarian societies. There is, as well, a care and kindness in the ancient records, a generosity of vision, which the draftsmen and designers extended to their images of all living things. Just as the texts of many royal mining expeditions carefully record the safe return of all their personnel and their packed donkeys, so, too, The text in Jehoshaphat's tomb chapel frequently affirm that all the men of the 4 gangs of conscripts that hauled the alabaster colossus had accomplished that perilous enterprise in safety, without incident or loss. Such activities, therefore, should not be regarded as a public display of power, like those of the North Korean elite, nor certainly as Hollywood tricks out their depiction, with whips and chains. In Jehoshaphat's tomb chapel, the arrival of the Colossus is described in terms of general rejoicing. There was, as well, a celebration of the common human need to eat and procreate, the experience of cool rooms on hot days, of a warm dry corner in the winter, of the sensuousness of the human form that the craftsmen rendered so joyfully, of the preciousness of children in the pain suffered at their all too frequent deaths, as the pretty jewelry that Petrie found upon the babies buried at el-Lahun silently testifies. Babies. So the archaeologist reports, that he in turn had quietly reinterred within the nearby desert. Had those unfortunate children survived, they would have lived in a society where solidarity was stronger than that within the cities of the modern West, where people worked together in extraordinary close community, where for millennia the farmers and miners had provided the materials, tools and rations that enabled great monuments to be constructed, where the work of dozens of anonymous craftsmen had celebrated that extraordinary harmony in jointly creating a vast series of unique images, sculptural and architectural, such as the world would never make again. Those remarkable abilities had been fostered for millennia in thousands of small face-to-face communities, 2 long strings of riverside villages with a wide range of extraordinary natural resources at their disposal. When the court was not furiously building a royal pyramid or another major monument, even such settlements as Itj-towy had been small enough for its inhabitants to recognize each other, and all of their various components, the kings, the courtiers, the farmers, held a certain dignity in the fundamental understanding that they were all mutually interdependent. One of the finest stories to have survived from the times of the Middle Kingdom, in 4 separate papyri, is known today as the eloquent peasant. Like several other documents of the age, it is set in a previous interregnum, before the court of Itj-towy had been established. And like most of the so-called literary texts to have survived, the greater part of it is an essay upon style and manner. In this instance, however, the text also reflects on the pharaonic social order and on what is fair and unfair for the population, and the obligation which each part of that culture has towards the other. As in other documents of the time, people of all ranks and professions appear to address each other in a forthright manner and are more plain-spoken than is usually the case today, an impression underlined by contemporary sculpture and relief that similarly appears to show pharaonic culture as a canny and direct society. The story of the so-called eloquent peasant tells of the misadventures of a farmer named Kunanop as he travels down into the valley of the Lower Nile from a small desert oasis which lies to the west of the river's delta, known today as the Wadi el-Natron. En route, a minor state official tricks, beats and robs Kunanop, taking both his donkeys and the goods that they were carrying to market. And so energetically indignant is the farmer in defense of what many would still consider to be the tenets of a just society that, on hearing his impassioned plea, the local governor sends word of Kunanop's eloquence to the king. Sensing entertainment, it would appear, the king then orders the governor to detain Kunanop, that his household should be given rations and that the process of his petitioning should be extended so that a scribe could record his additional orations. So poor Kunanop is constrained to make no less than 9 more speeches, each one displaying growing anger and frustration at the injustice he has suffered, and also at bureaucracy's apparent sloth. Shall I eat your bread and drink your beer forever? Finally, in exasperation, he threatens suicide, and the dismal process is halted and Kunanop is awarded the goods and holdings of the man who did him wrong, his wheat, his barley, his donkeys, his pigs, his cattle. Beneath this literary record of fearless eloquence, there runs a subtle counterpoint of Kafka-like entanglement, of the loss of freedom and of the cruelties inherent in the order of any structured state, the same issues, indeed, that modern states still wrestle with today. The story starts, however, in the heartlands of pharaonic culture, amidst the warm, sweet breezes of the live Egyptian countryside. Epilogue. Reflections on a Golden Age. The poetry of craftsmanship, Middle Kingdom. Material culture. Some of the most moving images that humanity has ever made were sculpted in Middle Kingdom studios. Much of the painting and sculpted relief of the period is exquisite, the court jewelry unsurpassed. Even the daily products of the Itj-towy potters are very fine. Clearly, the Itj-towy court had realized the vision of the Intefs and the Mentuhoteps in magnificent fashion. During the 2 centuries of its existence, the Itj-towy court not only re-established high pharaonic culture, its crafts, its architecture and writing, but refined it, bestowing upon it a delicacy and balance that enriched the pharaonic scriptoria and craftsmen's workshops for the next 2,000 years. All in all, it was an intense and thoughtful enterprise. Today, unfortunately, there is a considerable gap in our understanding of the Middle Kingdom's crafts and architecture. The major enterprises of its court, the beating heart of pharaonic culture, its state monuments, and Itj-towy itself, have all but disappeared. Even its colossal statues were recut and reinscribed by later kings, set more lightly on the earth than the Memphite monuments and largely obliterated by lime burners and later temple builders. Apart from the tomb chapels of the provincial governors, all that remains are fragments of a lost and distant age. At the beginning, however, in the age in which Mentuhotep II's Theban temple tomb was built, things seem clear enough. The craftsmen and builders lived in an age bent on regaining the full panoply of pharaonic culture and thus the technical proficiency held in the Memphite studios. This was a long and somewhat self-conscious process, as some of the passages of a text engraved upon a stela of a certain artisan inadvertently underlined, engraved upon a slab of fine white limestone almost 4 feet high. Artisan's stela holds 15 horizontal lines of carefully engraved hieroglyphs and, underneath, a sunken tableau drawn in the traditional manner, showing the craftsman and his wife seated before a bread-laden offering table scattered with game and joints of meat. Despite artisans' claims, the relief is dull, naive, a half-memory of the provincial sculpture from the times of the late Saqqara kings. The stela's text, however, is unique. No other pharaonic craftsman ever saw fit to describe his skill with such determination other than through the medium of his craft. To that extent, it outlines the aims and the ambitions of his age, for the courtly crafts and architecture were of supreme importance to pharaonic identity. At the same time, a critical self-consciousness is arising in the studios and workshops, a new space between the craftsmen and their work. The southern workshops that were maintained by the court of the Intefs and the Mentuhoteps had led the way in the revival, and although the craftsmen generally employed provincial, careful, solid, southern forms and compositions, many of their larger royal works are better designed and drawn than artisan stela. Many of them, too, retain some of the engaging and eccentric innovations of the draftsmen who had worked during the interregnum, such as those who had designed and painted Ankhtifi's pillared tomb chapel at Moola. The breakthrough, the reattainment of the gravitas and high skill that had been held within the Memphite court, came after the move to Itj-towy. For there the southern craftsmen seem to have encountered the skill and style held in the rump of the Saqqara workshops, and together they studied the manners of the times of the Giza kings and, reign by reign, created the distinctive synthesis of the mature Middle Kingdom style. The initial change from older provincial manners to courtly style was accomplished in the first decades following the move to Itj-towy, and so quickly that several of the monuments of the queens and courtiers at Deir el-Bahari show the old and new styles side by side. In similar fashion, the Theban tomb chapel attributed to Senat, Vizier Antiphocles' mother, offers an extraordinary contrast with the courtly mastaba of her son at Lisht. Set in a thin rock-cut corridor, two of the walls of Senat's tomb chapel are painted in a charming naive style, and with such spry and lively detail that it is one of the great delights within that vast necropolis. Antiphocles' monument, on the other hand, had stood beside the pyramid of Amenemhat I and had taken the form of the mud brick mastabas and palaces of the times of the first kings, but was sculpted in an eclectic, somewhat etiolated mix of archaism and innovation. And as its surviving fragments, some of which hold the account of his voyage to the Lebanon, show, they already display the elegance of the emergent courtly style, with the exception of the jewel-like kiosk of Senwosret at Karnak, which was reassembled in the 1920s from blocks retrieved from the foundations of a later monument. Very little remains of the court architecture of those times, although the court craftsmen were building and decorating temples all over the kingdom, from the Delta and Heliopolis to Abydos, Thebes, and Aswan. At the same time, however, the craftsmen of the households of the provincial governors were creating splendid tomb chapels with a distinctive use of columns and pillars. Inside the chapels, too, much innovative subject matter was introduced, such as the scene in the tomb chapel of Jehushotep at Deir el-Bersha, which shows the hauling of a colossus, and that of Khnumhotep's father at Beni Hassan, which pictures a group of Amu people. Other scenes, too, in the Beni Hassan tomb chapels hold elaborate images of sieges and desert hunts with monstrous animals, and bouts of wrestling and a range of other entertainments, all painted in a fine high style, the like of which had not been seen before. From Thinis, near Abydos, downstream to Beni Hassan, these governors' tombs are now part of a well-trodden tourist trail, Ka el-Kabir, Asib, Mayor, Deir el-Bersha and the rest, and they all display the livelier side of provincial life, observed with a keen eye and often painted in a genuinely innovative style. Some of them hint that their painters copied forms from Crete and other northern cultures, to which such delta ports as Tel el-Daba had given access. The key to this burst of innovation, however, lies with the draftsmen scribes who sometimes painted lengthy texts, writings in the manner of, in part, derived from, the pyramid texts, onto the courtiers' cedar coffins. Few earlier draftsmen had shown such skill. For the first time, for example, some painters come to terms with changes in the color of pleated clothes, and bird plumage, and even the glowing ashes of a wood fire, all in exquisite detail. These are some of the surviving masterworks of ancient Egyptian painting, and they emphasize the magnitude of the almost total loss of contemporary courtly monuments. Hints of what has gone, however, the spare crisp line of fine relief, a novel use of space and design, are preserved on some of the royal stelae of the age and on the few remaining lintels of various temple doorways. Some of the most complex designs that ancient Egyptian craftsmen ever made, such works show an extraordinary and entirely novel sophistication. With the stelae, the draftsmen sometimes work with but a few scanty motifs to produce hieroglyphic compositions of rare simplicity. On the temple lintels, alternatively, the simple heraldic oppositions of Old Kingdom designers are transformed into elaborate, harmonious patterns in which the figures of the king and gods sit within complex, balanced lattices of verticals and horizontals. These, then, show a maturation of the earlier courtly style. The same rare sense of balance and design is held in the court jewelry of the age. Here, too, is the pharaonic craftsman's ability to change the scale of things, from the colossal to the minuscule, to produce objects in an enormous range of different sizes without any loss of coherent form. A foretaste of what was to come is seen in the strings of semi-precious stones and silver beads found in the burials of the royal women at Deir el-Bahari, and also on the mummy of Maquette Rees estate manager Wall, who was buried with 2 splendid silver scarabs and necklaces of faience and silver. Those fine pieces, however, are eclipsed by Thephamus hordes of domestic jewelry from the burials of 9 royal women and courtiers who were entombed at the royal pyramids of Dashur and el-Lahun, and whose crypts had lain relatively undisturbed throughout the following millennia, deep beneath the rubble and destruction wrought by generations of lime burners and stone thieves in the cemeteries above. Although the later discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun has eclipsed those earlier treasures, the jewelry of those royal women holds a restraint not present in the work of later ages: the gentle textures, the soft stone and shining metals, the scale, the harmonious design, the unmatched technical skill, the sheer delight of the Itj-towy craftsman, working in pure gold and purple amethyst, in fine blue faience, turquoise and lapis lazuli, making rings, bracelets, girdles, collars, pectorals and necklaces for the women of the Itj-towy court. And once again, some of the techniques used in the jewelers' workshops had come to Itj-towy from the north, from the Levant and the Aegean. The simplicity and elegance of the Itj-towy jewelry is encapsulated in its use of seashells. Cowries brought from the Red Sea were drilled to serve as simple beads, or their forms were beautifully sculpted in gold, strung together on amuletic girdles alongside small dark carnelians, shaped and polished to resemble acacia seeds. They would have rattled at the slightest movement, for the golden shells had little pellets in them. Polished oyster shells were strung on necklaces as pendants, known as healthy ones. They were often edged in gold, minutely decorated with filigree, cloisonné and granulation, and the cartouche of the reigning king. Men, alternatively, could wear necklaces of a line of tubular faience beads with a pendant oyster shell, whose shining surfaces were lightly engraved with a cartouche drawn in a single delicate line filled with lamp-black pigment. Images of kings. The most evocative part of the garland that surrounds the central void of Itj-towy's courtly culture are the royal sculptures, because to modern eyes they look like portraits of individual people, whilst hundreds of these sculptures have survived. Most are smashed and broken, and only a handful are intact, notably a hoard of 10 life-size limestone statues of Senwosret, carefully buried in a pit at Lisht, and some colossal sphinxes that were found in the northeastern delta amidst the jumbled blocks of ancient Thinis. Such is the power of the royal sculpture, however, that even the damaged and fragmented works fuse easily together in the mind to create a line of perfect, powerful images of Middle Kingdom royalty. Once again, the journey to maturity began at Thebes, where Mentuhotep II's craftsmen made a series of sculptures of their king to stand in and around his temple tomb. The finest that survives is a near life-size sculpture that had been wrapped in linen and buried like a human corpse, which was found in one of the burial chambers of that temple tomb. Plate 2. Heavily painted, wide-eyed, full-formed, and with tremendous presence, it already shows a complete command of finished sculptural form, cut from the same distinctive sandstone that is used throughout the temple tomb. It is the epitome of Theban style. After the move to Itj-towy, the court sculptors started to examine older Memphite works that lay close at hand. So while some of the colossi of Senwosret that had stood along the causeway to his pyramid display the Theban manner, others derived their qualities from some of Sneferu's sculptures made 6 centuries before, buried fresh from the craftsman's studios and never set within a temple. The 10 perfect over life-sized seated statues of that king which were found at Lisht show that their sculptors employed a standard Memphite prototype of the sculptures of the Giza kings for their bodies, but placed a series of fresh young faces atop that ideal form to create a tension that, to modern eyes, imparts a curious fragility. Here, the sculptors of Itj-towy are developing manners in which many traditional forms are subtly changed in ways that appear today to be more naturalistic. Some of the sculptors of the following king, Amenemhat I, used the Great Sphinx of Giza as a model for the royal head, measuring that enormous image and recasting it in a series of large-eared, round-eyed, full-lipped royal faces, set upon the 15-foot-long granite body of a solidly ferocious sphinx, the most celebrated and most perfect of these powerful works was found at Thinis in the 19th century and transported to the Louvre. Ageless, enigmatic, highly mannered, that same face would serve as a model for dozens of later sculptures of royal sphinxes and colossi over many centuries. Occasionally, the court craftsman looked further back into the past. A commanding, over life-size granite sculpture of Amenhotep for example, wears the elaborate wig, jewelry and animal skins of an archaic priest, whilst the forms of the face owe much to sculptures of those archaic times. See Plate 18. On other occasions, the royal craftsmen seem to have reused forms and poses employed by the sculptors of the Old Kingdom courtiers. Others still employed provincial forms, whilst the idea of a very young pharaonic face was revisited, along with an increasing attention towards the naturalism of proportion. At the other extreme, some royal heads display their kings with careworn, heavy-lidded faces, though always set upon the perfect Memphite torso first designed in the time of the Giza kings. Young and old, sphinx-like or provincial, these different statue types were sometimes set up side by side. And certainly, those diverse statue types underline the fact that Middle Kingdom style was a carefully cultivated identity rather than some kind of innate ethnic expression, as was long assumed to have been the case. Changes in the technology of statue making had greatly aided the eclecticism of the Itj-towy sculpture studios. For the first time, it appears, some chisels were made of bronze rather than hardened copper, which allowed jewelry, wigs and beards to be elaborated in far greater detail, or at least with greater ease. Hence, too, the fine sharp edges upon the eyes and mouths, the sphinx's claws, of hard stone statues. Fine lines that had only previously been seen on softer limestone sculptures. By the later Middle Kingdom, the metal workers had gained an increasing command of alloys and inlays, and bronze was being cast in life-size statues such as those that appear to have been recovered from the enclosure of Amenhotep III's pyramid at Hawara. Such statues employed a technique that precisely reproduced in bronze the forms of a sculpture made from softer substances such as clay, wax or sand. This had provided the royal sculptors with an entirely different way of making form, by addition rather than subtraction, as in traditional stone carving. And the process, it appears, had enlarged the sculptors' sensibilities. For surfaces of granite, serpentine and quartzite started to be treated anew in different ways. Now, for example, the forms of a royal face could be produced by rubbing the statue with abrasive powder, not in the manner employed in earlier sculptures that gave a high shine to rounded concave surfaces, but so as to reduce the form of the stone and to reproduce the softer, convex folds of older male faces. Such is the nature of this work, indeed, that some of those old heads could have been reworked from statues that had previously shown a young and ideal king. And both types of heads still top perfect, ideal Memphite bodies. At all events, those extraordinarily powerful Old King images of Senwosret III and Amenhotep III, whose combined reigns could have totaled 70 years and more, are some of the finest sculptures ever made. Their smashed and broken stones fragmentary evocations of strong, hard-worked, old age. Plate 19. Many of these different styles of royal sculpture similarly appear in the generations of the noble sculpture. These, then, are images of pharaonic courtiers as they had never been shown before. Although the lively, full-bodied sculpture of the Memphite court could also show a male courtier, if not the female statues, which are invariably shown in eternal Memphite youth, in portly, prosperous middle age, which when illuminated and photographed display expressions similar to those of a Baroque portrait or the photographs of Yusuf Karsh of Ottawa, with the notable exception of the now-vanished alabaster colossus of Jehushotep. The courtiers of Itj-towy are not well represented in hard stone sculpture. On Elephantine Island, however, at granite-rich Aswan, many hard stone images of courtiers were preserved in perfect condition, standing in a gathering of shrines set within a unique monument, dedicated to the cult of a certain Hekib, sole companion, lector priest, overseer of foreigners who instills the fear of Horus in foreign lands. Hekib had been one of those late Old Kingdom travelers to Nubia and the Levant whose tombs stand in the cemeteries in the Aswan cliffs. For reasons yet unknown, generations of later local governors and courtiers had honored Hekib as if he were a god, so that today his strange shrine, which was excavated by the Egyptian Service des Antiquités under the direction of Labi Babachi, is one of the few places on earth where the Middle Kingdom stands all around you, a geometrically precise environment filled with images of tough-looking determined men, each one in his separate shrine. Are such images portraits in a modern sense? Certainly, the attributes of individual faces can be detected amongst a range of Middle Kingdom sculptures emblazoned with royal cartouches in the names of courtiers, and they give easy, characterful identities to individuals that otherwise are largely enigmatic. Many traditional historians, indeed, freely use the careworn portraits of the kings as ancient equivalents of those images of Mussolini burning the midnight oil in the Palazzo Venezia, though here, of course, they worked throughout the night to plan the flood defenses of the Fayum rather than to drain the Pontine marshes. From there, of course, it is but a short step to peopling such texts as the stories of Sinuhe and Kunana, the so-called eloquent peasant, with emotions sensed in the statues of the Middle Kingdom courtiers, standing in the central courtyard of the Shrine of Hekib. However, under the gaze of a dozen such statues, you are primarily aware that group solidarity was the main ingredient of those courtiers' identities, and that, as so many of ancient Egypt's texts and images insist, their notion of personal identity was tied to their behavior as it affected the order of the state. To modern eyes, therefore, such apparently characterful sculptures call into question the nature of portraiture itself. The problem is not one of the extent of such sculptures' realism, for the reproduction of the exact forms of an individual human face is not what portraits are about. No human on the planet, for example, has a face with the proportions of the head of the Giza Sphinx, yet we read that ancient face in terms of human personality as easily as we read deep emotion in Rembrandt's portraits. With Middle Kingdom sculpture we encounter in full measure the astonishing ability of ancient Egyptian craftsmen to endow the forms of their subject matter with the qualities of life. It fills even the fragments off those ancient images, and produces the tension between the ancient stones and modern notions of individual human character. To that extent, perhaps, the works of Middle Kingdom sculptors can be seen as an example of that common trend in the history of artistry and craftsmanship in which the works of earlier ages have seemed to subsequent generations to have rendered their subject matter so completely that the only way to endow new works with authenticity was to repossess the old forms and, by a kind of magical skill, overlay them with fresh observations of living form. Looking back, looking forward, Senwosret 3's Abydos tomb. Though there is little left today of the Itj-towy pyramids beyond shapeless piles of mud brick, the designers and builders of those once great monuments had looked back to the earlier tradition, so that for half a millennium and more the desert plain that runs from Giza down to Lisht had been studded with a series of high, white, similarly angled, perfectly formed pyramids. The cultural confluence between the courts of Memphis and Itj-towy had run very deep. At Dashur, sherds of old Kingdom pottery were mixed into the mud bricks of Middle Kingdom pyramids, for pottery of that earlier period was still strewn across the Site. The Itj-towy potters. 2. Made wares imitating Old Kingdom forms and colorings that were designed to hold the oils and unguents required for purification and for offering within Memphite tomb chapels. In the cemeteries of Lisht, offerings were made that copied those of Old Kingdom burials. Such was the careful replication of earlier ways, indeed, that it has been suggested that the large quantities of such vessels that remain reflect the numbers of offerings which are detailed in the Memphite offering lists. Underneath the Itj-towy pyramids, however, the court builders constructed an astonishing variety of innovative interior architectures. Reign after reign, increasingly elaborate systems of pits, corridors and chambers, all of them exquisitely built, twist and turn beneath the pyramid's mud brick vaults, performing a series of architectural tricks that obscure the place of royal burial whilst at the same time performing arpeggios on many of the ancient forms of royal burial. 1. Pharaoh's great, grand granite sarcophagus, for example, imitates the then 700-year-old walls of the first pyramid enclosure, whilst the burial chamber of another is cut from a single block of quartzite weighing more than 100 tons. It is usually assumed that those elegant mazes were devised to foil wicked robbers, yet enormous care was taken in their construction, which was hardly necessary for such purposes, and all interested parties, from ancient robbers to modern archaeologists, have well understood that no such monument is impregnable, so those fine interiors had probably held more elevated purposes than mere security. At all events, they certainly exhibit a desire to both embellish and protect pharaonic burial with Itj-towy's finest craftsmanship. Though none of the Itj-towy pyramids hold any texts at all, the writings in the tombs and tomb chapels of the courtiers of both the Memphite and the Itj-towy kingdoms tell that the rites of funeral and destiny and death were much the same for king and courtier. The essential difference in their funerary arrangements, therefore, had reflected the position of the person in society, whereas the courtiers, as the texts and images in their tomb chapels insistently inform us, were distinguished by their role within the organization of the state. Pharaoh did not require such validation. Their role placed them above all offices of state, all courts, all provinces, each of their pyramids a universal cosmic model that gave pattern and meaning to the landscape, and life and order to the living kingdom. So the decision in the reign of Senwosret III to build the king an enormous royal tomb with no pyramid at all and to set it far away from the traditional burial grounds of Memphis represents a revolution in the court's understanding of the nature of kingship itself. In some ways, however, the transformational tomb that the Itj-towy court made for Senwosret III at Abydos still followed the architectural precedents of the tombs of his royal forebears, with a temple set down near the edge of the cultivated land, the entrance to the tomb itself situated in the desert up above, and those two units, tomb and temple, set upon a single axis which, at Abydos, is almost a third of a mile long. In place of a pyramid, at Abydos the position of the royal tomb was marked out upon the desert by clearing an area of some 5 acres of rock and edging it in mud brick, in the T-shaped form of an archaic altar. As at the Itj-towy pyramids, mastabas were built beside this huge enclosure along with a pair of dummy mastabas to hold the debris from the excavation of the royal tomb. 4. Running steeply down from the surface of the T-shaped enclosure, far into the desert's underlying limestone, is the enormous excavation of the tomb's corridors and chambers that are some 700 feet in length and end beneath the cliffs that fringe the Nile-side desert, more than 3 times larger and longer than the corridors and chambers beneath Senwosret III's pyramid at Dashur. The architecture of his Abydos tomb turns in the same disorientating manner as the interiors of most of the Itj-towy pyramids, a quality they share with the convoluted routes through the palaces that end in the audience chamber, or those through some of the temples of the period that led to the shrines of the gods. Here, though, excavating in rock rather than building with rectangular bricks and blocks of stone, a similar asymmetry is achieved by employing a long semicircular curve rather than a series of right angles. In the manner of the contemporary pyramids, this huge corridor is beautifully lined with blocks of fine white limestone, though in its lower curving sections the limestone is sometimes replaced with slabs of tough red quartzite, one of the hardest rocks that ancient Egyptian craftsmen ever worked. Here, as at the Itj-towy pyramids, elaborate architectural tricks were employed to disguise the place of burial. In this instance, the sarcophagus was part hidden in a small chamber set halfway through the excavation. That some of the quartzite blocks of the walls in the lower corridor were torn down, it would appear, in a determined search to locate further hidden rooms and corridors, shows the temporary success of that architectural ploy, although, as in all other royal tombs, the sarcophagus was eventually opened. Until its recent re-excavation by a team led by Joseph Wenger, this anomalous, somewhat enigmatic monument was considered to be a cenotaph, a kind of model tomb in the caprice of a king who must have had some kind of special attachment to Abydos, which, after all, was the most sacred pilgrimage site within the kingdom. And had that king not already had a proper grave, a pyramid built in the manner of his predecessors on the plain of Dashur? Yet many earlier kings had two tombs prepared for them, the interminable archaeological debate about which one had actually housed the royal body, ignoring the vital role that their construction had played within the living state. In the times of the Memphite kings, for example, a secondary tomb in the form of a small pyramid had been built close to the major monument. Senwosret III's successor, alternatively, had two full-sized pyramids built in his name, one on the Dashur plain, the other at Hawara by the entrance to the Fayum. The Abydos tomb, moreover, was certainly planned and built by the same school of court craftsmen and designers who had planned and built the pyramids at Lisht, Dashur and el-Lahun. And at Abydos as at el-Lahun, they also constructed a gridded courtly settlement beside Senwosret III's Valley Temple, to house the court's regional officials and, presumably, the priests and servants of the royal cult. Recent excavations at the enclosure that holds Senwosret III's Abydos tomb have determined that some large mud brick buildings had stood briefly in the area, and the debris from those structures suggests that rites had been conducted within it on a considerable scale, though over a short period of time. Such intense short-lived activities suggest that, whether or not a royal corpse had actually been involved, elaborate rites of funeral had taken place. What, then, had prompted the remarkable decision to build a gigantic royal tomb without a pyramid and to set it far away from the traditional burial grounds of Memphis? There is precedent for the shape of Senwosret III's Abydos tomb and also for at least one interment to have taken place within it. For the temple tomb of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahari has two tombs for the royal burial. One is entered by a corridor that runs deep beneath the Theban cliffs from the temple's second terrace, the other by a long deep passageway cut down into the middle of the plain in front of the temple tomb, in a manner very similar to the entrance to Senwosret III's Abydos tomb. And in that second tomb, whose entrance lies within the temple's wide and flat enclosure, the celebrated colossal statue of Mentuhotep was laid to rest amidst a gathering of offerings. The court of Senwosret III, moreover, showed a direct interest in that Theban monument, and placing a splendid series of over life-size statues of their king upon a terrace there. There was as well a strong and very ancient precedent for siting royal tombs at Abydos. For the subterranean cemetery of Egypt's first kings lies less than 2 miles away from the enclosure that contains Senwosret III's tomb. And, once again, the Itj-towy court displayed direct and powerful involvement with those ancient monuments. For, in their times, one of those ancient royal tombs was cleared, restored and reopened as the tomb of the god Osiris, and in the manner of the arrangements at Senwosret III's Abydos tomb and funerary temple, a Considerable temple for Osiris was erected at the edge of the cultivation. The Itj-towy court, therefore, and specifically that of Senwosret III, had returned to the heartland of their state and copied many of its ancient ways. And at the same time they set a precedent for the design of all later royal tombs. For the courts of later ages did not return to Memphis as the location for the royal tomb, nor did they employ the form of pyramids, but took Senwosret III's Abydos tomb as the model for all royal burials. Situated at the foot of the valley's cliffs at a point where the rock terraces form an enormous natural pyramid, the setting of the Abydos tomb of Senwosret III presages that of the Theban royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, just as ceilings found in the debris of the structures that had stood beside the entrance to that Abydos tomb are the first known examples of a form typical of many ceilings found in the later royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings. In similar fashion, the plan of Senwosret III's Abydos tomb presages that of the first royal tomb to be cut in the Valley of the Kings. The immediate predecessor of those celebrated tombs, however, is sited to the south of Senwosret III's Abydos monuments, where the funerary complex of Ahmose, the first king of the later Theban dynasties, carefully copies the elaborate forms and structure of Senwosret III's earlier monuments, with a deep subterranean tomb excavated in the desert and a temple and a gridded settlement set down on the plain below. And in careful continuity, King Ahmose's complex was precisely orientated to that of Senwosret III so that together, the axes of their plans, which are a third of a mile apart, form a perfect square upon the desert sand. This, then, was the Middle Kingdom's enormous, if inadvertent, gift to the future pharaonic state. In abandoning Memphis as the site of royal burial and returning to the archaic heartland of their culture, and by designing a type of royal tomb directly related to the older forms of royal funeral in Upper Egypt, Senwosret III's designers signaled a change both in the role of pharaoh and the destiny of the ancestors. A destiny that in later ages would be expressed in celebrated texts that out upon the walls of the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, whose elaborate descriptions of death and resurrection echo the twisting passages and corridors of the Middle Kingdom royal tombs and, above all others, those of Senwosret III at ancient Abydos. The mind's eye, Middle Kingdom literature's court of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs not only re-established and refined the material culture of the pharaonic state but also simultaneously transformed the form and scope of hieroglyphic writing. For the modern world, this is the so-called classical period of ancient Egyptian texts, the age in which the venerable Memphite tradition was transformed to become the written language that is known today as Middle Egyptian. At that same time, the Itj-towy scribes created a literature whose texts would be copied out as exemplars of good manners and fine prose down to Greco-Roman times, texts that are widely regarded as ancient Egypt's literary masterpieces in which the pharaonic scribes of later ages and modern students of hieroglyphic were and are obliged to study. It has been estimated that less than 10,000 people could read and write in Itj-towy times, a fact that, if nothing else, re-emphasizes the small, face-to-face nature of that courtly culture. Leaving aside the traditional textual genres which remained a part, if a lively and developing part, of the scribal corpus, less than 40 of the novel so-called literary texts are known to have survived from Middle Kingdom times, and most of them, by modern standards, are fairly short. These are texts that are neither letters nor accountings, nor are they primarily connected with temples or tomb chapels, with offerings or decrees, written in a distinctive calligraphic script on rolls of leather and papyri, and mostly stored today in European museums. The best part of the original Middle Kingdom versions of these literary texts were brought to light at Thebes in the 19th century. Sold on by merchants, they had probably been taken from ancient tombs, though only one of the places where they had been anciently stored is known today, the papyri having been discovered during an early archaeological excavation. found in a much-used burial vault beneath the storerooms of a later temple. This cache of decayed papyrus scrolls appears to have been part of the private library of a scribe, for a bundle of reed pens had been placed along with the papyri in a little whitewashed box. Amongst several other texts, that box of scrolls had held the story of Sinuhe and the story of Kanana, the eloquent peasant. Half of the Middle Kingdom literary texts that have survived were still being copied 1,000 years and more after their composition, and that is fortunate indeed, for those later copies include the Papyrus Westcar, which holds the only known version of the Tales of Hardiedev, and Jeti the Soothsayer, another Middle Kingdom text that only exists in these later copies is the so-called teaching of Keti, which has survived in some 250 fragmented versions made in many different ages. The name of Keti is given as the author of several other literary texts as well, and so a single scribe is sometimes claimed as the creator of ancient Egyptian literature. But, as shown earlier, Keti was a common name of those times, and more modern scholarship generally regards these literary Ketis in much the same manner as Homer or Hardiedev. Remarkably, the teaching of Keti, which is also known as the satire on the trades, extols the virtues of the nimble-fingered scribe above all other professions, whose members are described, along with many other fearful attributes, as swollen-fingered, weary as laborers, bleary-eyed, and festering, smelling as vile as fish eggs, and sometimes even covered in excrement. But Keti tells us that good literary manners are a sign of a social distinction, that if you know writing all will be well with you, that his teaching places his pupils on the path of God, and that the proper use of pen and ink can lead to high office at the royal residence. No wonder that he was much used in ancient schoolrooms, and is much quoted by modern academics too. In common with the visual culture of the times, Middle Egyptian literature developed in an atmosphere of retrospection. On the rocks of the Wadi Hammamat, an Itj-towy scribe scratched the names of 3 Memphite pharaohs, Khufu, Jafer, Khafra, side by side, and then erroneously promoted 2 ancient royal princes to the kingship, namely Hardiedev and Bafur, 5 cartouches set in a single row. It is a memory of an ancient kingdom founded on the timeless rule of gods and pharaohs which had disappeared, and as a result of this disjunction from that distant past another understanding of the state developed. With the Memphite pyramids in full view across the desert plain, the court of Itj-towy regarded that earlier age from a distance and with a new awareness of the court's fragility. Now the past was composed of human incident and time, and the future state could either succeed or fail. A preoccupation, perhaps reflected in the faces of the sculptures of the times. At all events, this was a reflective era, one in which scribes carefully copy the old ways of writing but at the same time transform them, one in which ancient courtly identity was cultivated with considerable care, down to the use of its very language. So, although the pyramids of the Itj-towy kings were never decorated with pyramid texts, some of those texts were placed in the burial chambers of a few Itj-towy courtiers, and on many contemporary coffins. And this inherited literary tradition was also used to create new texts filled with the values and attitudes that were considered necessary for the maintenance of the refounded state. Some of the underlying narratives of those new compositions were borrowed from earlier writings. Part of the story of the eloquent peasant, for example, resembles part of the ancient story of 2 gods, Horus and Seth, which is touched upon in the pyramid texts. Sometimes, ancient religious imagery provided a new tale with an eerie air, as in the story of the so-called shipwrecked sailor, where a man talks to a giant snake. And the structure of the literary texts of teaching and instruction was derived from the inscriptions in the Memphite tomb chapels that outline the good works of their owners. In similar fashion, the forms of the biographic inscriptions in the Memphite tomb chapels were enlarged and crossed with the narratives of Memphite expeditions, their departures, their adventures and their climax at the royal court. to contain the story of Senwosret. Some texts, however, have scant precedent. The dispute of a man with his soul, for example, dispassionately confronts the idea of death as no other pharaonic text had done before, whilst the admonitions of an Egyptian scribe, in which the world spins like a potter's wheel, works carefully and imaginatively through the collected misfortunes of society turned upside down in the way that the writers and visual artists of many later cultures would do. Yet the spirit of all those literary compositions, their clarity, their straightforwardness, is very different from anything that had been written down before. To some extent, their literary attitude was presaged in a claim found in several funerary texts that earnestly insist their words tell the truth, for that is an attitude to writing which, for the first time, posits a space for reflection between the reader and the text, a space that the Memphite scribes seem never to have imagined. Murdered by eunuchs? Modern history and ancient literature. Historians have traditionally used several of the stories in the literary text to conjure up political histories for the rulers of the Memphite and Itj-towy courts. And who can blame them, for there is little else on which to base such modern narratives. So the soothsayer Jetty's prophecy that the wife of a provincial priest will give birth to a triplet of kings is used as the basis of a political account of the transition between the 4th and 5th of Manetho's dynasties here, and the so-called prophecy of Nefertiti, which tells of the emergence of a warrior king of whom Asiatics will fall to his sword, Libyans to his flame and rebels to his wrath, is identified as Amenemhat I, who is then murdered by the guards or eunuchs of his palace as per the instruction of Amenemhat I, a plot with which the vizier Intifokar's son is sometimes said to be involved, for is he not cursed in an execration text? The self-same plot, indeed, is also said to have caused such disruption at the court that it had prompted Senwosret's flight to the Levant. Lively, if somewhat cliched, modern storytelling, certainly, but hardly ancient history. The arguments against using such sources for constructing political histories are legion. One of the most obvious objections, of course, is that narratives such as those outlined above are entirely dependent upon the rare fragments of text and papyri that have survived, for there is hardly any external evidence that specifically supports their place within a narrative. There are problems, too, in linking what are often unspecific and contested texts. Only one of the 4 sources used to create the narrative surrounding the alleged murder of Amenemhat I, for example, names a specific king, and the contents of that text, the instruction of Amenemhat I, are vigorously disputed by various modern translators who do not agree on the date of its composition or whether the voice of the text narrator, which is that of the king himself, is alive or dead. There are also fundamental methodological problems of procedure in determining which texts are suitable for selection. Can historians simply extract those passages that seem to them to be real history from texts that otherwise appear to be ahistorical or fantastic? No one, for example, would include in a modern history book the incident and the story of the shipwrecked sailor where the unfortunate mariner talks to a giant snake. What then of a god-king murdered in his palace by his eunuchs? Ultimately, treating such tales as political history is dependent upon the historian's personal vision of the past. The decision to regard the tale of the attack upon Amenemhat I's real history, for example, requires the assumption that the pharaohs of Itj-towy had been monarchs in much the same manner as those of Champollions' time. If they are assumed to have been the sole rulers of a society as competitive and dangerous as Champollions, then Amenemhat I may well have been a seasoned warrior. And if that king had previously been the vizier Amenemhat, who had usurped the throne as many have suggested, then his palace may well have been a perilous place. But further problems then arise in setting the text in the context of political history. Had its putative author been dead or alive at the time of its composition? Was it written as a Itj-towy's posthumous political testament, or as a guide from an embattled living monarch to his son and successor. If the former, the text could be read as a document that aims to legitimize familial succession after a royal murder. If the latter, it could have been intended as palace propaganda, as an explanation of how those two kings had ruled simultaneously as co-regents, just as many historians believe, though others yet deny. And so the processes of historical methodology are ignored, and the words and tenses of the text are minutely scrutinized to determine whether its narrator is alive or dead. Now, clearly, it would be foolish to imagine that the terms of the European classical grammar through which most translations of the ancient texts are yet refracted, such notions as the first-person singular, the possessive, and even past and present tenses, can accurately reflect the minds of people who lived within a different universe and with a different sense of time and self. And so traditional historians are themselves swiftly led into the realms of literature, into discussions of motives and emotions of individual ancient characters, discussions that are sometimes even illustrated by the sculptured portraits of those self-same kings. And, of course, questions of modern political attitudes start to emerge. Was Amenemhat, or indeed Richard III, weak or strong? Good or bad, Plantagenet or Shakespearean? Do we prefer the 19th century's Thomas Cromwell or that of Wolf Hall? And that, inevitably, tells us far more about the modern singers than the ancient song. In the first days of their translation, Middle Kingdom literary texts had been regarded as folk tales. Erwin, for example, had dubbed the tales of the Papyrus Westcar fairy stories. At that time, however, there was widespread academic interest in the relationship of history to folk tales. Myth and fairy stories such as those that had been collected by the eminent Göttingen linguists the Brothers Grimm. Such texts, it was asserted, held the keys to understanding primitive mentalities, a view that prevailed well into the last century. At the same time, many early classical scholars had believed that classical myths and folk tales held oral histories in the manner of the Iliad and the Odyssey, a notion that was swiftly taken up by Protestant Bible scholars and also by the Berlin school of Egyptologists, who conjured a considerable history of the beginnings of the pharaonic state from Greco-Roman accounts of ancient Egyptian myth. So the renowned historian Edward Meyer, the unofficial chronologer of the Berlin School, quoted selected passages of Middle Kingdom literature in his influential 5-volume History of the Ancient World. Folk literature, Meyer maintained, contained a critical source of historical fact, a statement that, at a stroke, effectively extended the insistence of the renowned School of Berlin historians on the use of original source material into the realms of ancient Egyptian literature, and that, it would appear, is the root of much of ancient Egypt's pseudo-history. For the Middle Kingdom court was neither primitive nor savage nor, certainly, was it a so-called folk culture. Quite the reverse. The composition of its literary texts had been restricted to the few thousand courtly scribes who developed a formal mode of literary composition, and the grammar that is known today as Middle Egyptian. And as a steward of Senwosret makes clear in part of his funerary Stella's text, this was an accomplishment of which they were perfectly aware. I am one who speaks in the official manner, free from the use of the or. This, i.e. the definite article, in this despite the fact that the definite article had long since been recorded in the chatter of workmen, given an earlier tomb chapel text here. Ultimately, therefore, the use of Middle Kingdom literature as history must depend upon the kind of history you value, either the recycling of Western political narratives and Orientalist clothing or more tentative histories that deal in different aspects of life within a long-lost ancient culture. What is indisputably true about Middle Kingdom literature is that the limits of its imagination, the air in which those stories move, derive from the culture in which they were created. And certainly, they provide vivid and genuine alternative visions of ancient courtly life to the relentless optimisms of the tomb chapel texts. They tell us something more as well about how the ancient courtiers had thought, no matter if the literary account of the murder of a king of the Itj-towy court is fact or fantasy. The accommodation of such a deed within the near contemporary literature not only places it within the realm of ancient possibilities but also, and crucially, further distinguishes the man Amenivit from the office of Pharaoh, and that fact alone offers a rare insight into an age in which hardly a single genuine fact concerning the royal role within the state has been established. The greater part of the Middle Kingdom's literary texts are not narratives at all but essays on comportment and behavior, not stories, but instructions, teachings and discourses. Even they're much argued over. Narratives are filled with careful descriptions of courtly behavior, with exemplars of modes of address, of good manners and the proper conduct. In audience with Pharaoh and when talking to monsters, foreigners and fellow inhabitants of the kingdom. Obviously, the ancient Egyptian scribes could not have written the hard political narrative that we have today, for the genre did not exist. Just as there were no commodities in the modern sense of that word at the Itj-towy court, so no one valued narratives of news or, indeed, of history. The Middle Kingdom scribes' understanding of the past had grown out of the disjunction between the court of Memphis and that of Itj-towy, and it had led them to a self-conscious awareness of courtly identity as an essential part of their living culture. So whilst the craftsmen and builders of their time recreated and refined the material culture of the Memphite court, the scribes recorded and refined traditional courtly comportment and behavior down to the very manners of its writing. The literary text can provide genuine glimpses into the ancient past, most immediately into its modes of social intercourse and the proper attitudes to Pharaoh, the gods and the ancestors, and to all those things which the people of the remade pharaonic state needed to live in good order, community and well-being. That is why the images and texts of that ancient courtly culture have a lively beauty, a conviviality of elegance and form. The ending of Itj-towy is mysterious. The ancient records seem to signal its demise as they do for the ending of the Old Kingdom, by recording the rule of a female pharaoh, Queen Neferuzebek, this time around. However, there is nothing in the archaeological record to suggest that the court's decline was a product of ecological change. Even the destructive Nile floods that had occurred in the reign of Amenivit III appear to have ceased. Nor is there evidence of plagues or poor harvests that would have denied Itj-towy the manpower and the surpluses required to build grand monuments. There is no evidence, either, of internal revolution or violent invasion, no collapsing house of cards, no trace of odd and squalid mess of history. All that the spare surviving records show is that after 1790 BC, in the century and a half that followed the lengthy reign of Amenivit III, the period that the Greek historian Manetho would name the 13th dynasty of kings, pharaohs came and went with such rapidity that their very number and the order of their rule is still a matter of dispute. And in those times, great pyramids were no longer made, and the few small pyramids that were set amidst the earlier grander monuments of South Saqqara and Dashur were seldom finished. Then, too, there were no more additions to the lines of pretty tomb chapels that had long served the cults of the provincial governors. In Nubia the state retreated. The fortresses were abandoned and families of local people moved into their four-square mud brick chambers. At Ain Sukna and the lagoon of the Wadi Gawasis, the court ports were first deserted and then swiftly swallowed by the dunes of the eastern desert, and the chatter of graffiti drawn onto the rocks and boulders of the quarries of the Wadi Hammamat by the expeditions of the Itj-towy court first slacken, and then cease. And no more texts were set beside the seams of amethyst in the Wadi el-Hudi, upon the alabaster cliffs of Hatnaubor at the copper mines of Sinai and the temple at Serbet el-Qadam. So the expeditions that the Itj-towy court once sent to obtain fine Stone for the state workshops and copper for the craftsmen's tools first. Slow then stopped completely, along with the caravans and fleets that it had once dispatched to Nubia, to the land of Punt and to the Lebanon. Predicting just such a disaster, a scribe of an earlier generation had admonished his readers to remember the building of the shrine, the censing with incense, the pouring of a libation from a vessel at dawn. Now, however, the court no longer had the resources to build great pyramids or to maintain temples plastered white as milk or to set offering tables within perfumed sanctuaries to receive bread and game from estates up and down the lower Nile. Remember, the scribe continues, the upholding of regulations, the correct ordering of the calendar, these are the days that precede eternity, the months that are counted, the years that are known. But the court's activities, the essential underlying mechanism of tithe and offering that had supported both the living and the dead of the Itj-towy court and was its very core, had slowly slipped away. Some of the ephemeral pharaohs of the 13th dynasty had ruled from Itj-towy, the contents of the papyrus found in the tomb of the court scribe Neferhotep, for example, contains the household accounts of one of those transient monarchs during his visit to Thebes. And the royal workshops were maintained, although their output was considerably diminished, for some of the stonework of those small unfinished pyramids is of the highest quality. So, too, are the contemporary royal sculptures, several of which were hidden away inside the Grand Pyramid enclosures of the earlier Itj-towy kings and found in prime condition by archaeologists. Yet that regiment of little kings seems to have come and gone with such rapidity, more than 50 were listed in the Torah canon, that it appears as if the office of pharaoh was being determined by a round robin of Itj-towy officialdom, a situation suggestive of a change in the role of pharaoh itself. Nothing is known of the ending of that court, just as the household of the kings for whom the first pyramids had been built now seems to have risen out of nowhere. So, too, 9 centuries later, the household of the Itj-towy kings fades back into the blank void, as a stream might gently dry in the course of a summer's drought. At the ending there is simply nothing left to say, only to remark once more how very tenuous, how fragile and how fortunate is our continuing connection with those ancient people, how precious the surviving fragments of their lives. Quietly, however, in that same period of time, on the low-silled plains of the river's eastern delta, beside the seaside harbors of the Itj-towy kings, whose courts had delighted in the produce of the Levant, of Cyprus and of Anatolia, new settlements were being built, their modest tombs and temples laid out in the manners of Syria and the North Levant. And another history was beginning.